I'm in my office out in the yard, so I think he's sleeping in his little swing in the family room.
It's a big pond in your background. I know where that is.
Recording in progress.
Okay, I'm ready.
You ready, Marty?
Ready.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to all the planning commissioners, to my fellow council members, members of the public, interested parties. It's Wednesday, May 4th at 6 o'clock. This is a special joint meeting of the Moraga Planning Commission and Moraga Town Council. This meeting is being conducted pursuant to the provisions of Government Code Section 54953, which authorizes teleconference meetings under the Brown Act during certain proclaimed states of emergency. Consistent with the Government Code, this meeting will be held via teleconference only and will not be physically open to the public. Town council members, planning commissioners, and staff will be teleconferencing into the meeting by audio or video. It will be conducted via Zoom webinar. To maximize public safety while maintaining transparency and public access, members of the public may observe the meeting by watching or listening to the meeting through the link provided on the town's website. Live verbal public comments may be made by members of the public using joining the meeting via Zoom. Zoom access information is provided on the agenda or on the town website. Use the raised hand feature if you'd like to make a public comment. All right, I will call this meeting to order and take a roll call. Commissioners, Bodie.
I'm here.
Thank you. Davis.
Hi, here.
Commissioner Helber, I understand, is on vacation. Polsky.
Present.
Thiel.
Present.
Vice Chair Luster.
Here.
Chair Hillis.
Here.
Council members. Macker.
Here.
Onoda.
Here.
McClure.
Here.
Vice Mayor Wolke.
Here.
And Mayor Sauce is here. All right, next item on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. I want to invite the Chair of the Planning Commissioner and new father to baby Isaac James to lead us in the pledge. Carrie, would you please?
Absolutely. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Carrie. All right, next item is ordinances, resolutions, and requests for action. Item A, Comprehensive Advanced Planning Initiative. This agenda item is a study session. It's not an action item. So we will receive a presentation from staff and our able consultants and be asked to provide input and comments on 5 topics that are important to our continuing work to satisfy our RHNA allocations. First topic is parking standards. The second is the question of does one use density versus or FAR in multifamily situations. Third, should we increase the ream height limit to 45 feet, consistent with the MCSP? Fourth, should we pursue an inclusionary zoning ordinance? And fifth, and finally, should we allow for density transfers out of rural residential and very high fire severity zones on the one hand and into commercial zones on the other? So the structure for this will be, we'll have a presentation by Barry, Cynthia, Afsha, and team. Then we will have commissioner and council member questions. Again, questions, not statements. The statements will be made later in the program. Then we'll take public comment. Then we'll bring it back for commissioner and council member thoughts, input, and comments. So with that, Afsha, are you kicking it off?
Yes. Thank you,
The
Mayor.
floor is yours.
Thank you, Mayor, council members, and planning commissioners, and members of the public. Tonight, we're continuing a study session with Council and Planning Commission. And this discussion is regarding the Advanced Planning Initiative with a focus on tools to facilitate housing development. In the fall, we had a series and we had a kickoff meeting. We had legislative update and we had tools to create affordable housing. We're coming back with some more details as the mayor described. And the tools are being discussed in this presentation and staff report have been identified to go beyond zoning and discuss land use barriers that will be evaluated by HCD as part of the housing element. They are a way to increase new affordable housing choices in high resource areas. And the tools will also help advance the values and guiding principles in the general plan, which include open spaces, natural settings, semi-rural setting, and additionally, other guiding principles which are creating a community focal point in the Moraga Center and Reams Center areas, and housing with a variety of quality housing options in our community so that our children, seniors, and local workforce can continue to call Moraga home. The staff report tonight is timely as we consider policy direction to meet RHNA goals set by the state. The staff report has depth and breadth and complexity of information with subject matter expertise from our consultants tonight, discussions with local jurisdictions, surveys, responses from the community, as this is a community-based document, so we need to consider the community as a whole, discussion with developers as to what is working, and also staff has tapped additional resources with the Contra Costa County Collaborative that we are working with on a regular basis. So I'm going to introduce tonight Barry Miller with Barry Miller Consulting, Aaron Welch with Aaron Welch Planning, Stephanie Hagar with BAE, and our Assistant Town Attorney, Karen Murphy, and of course, Town Manager Cynthia Battenberg, and my name is Afshar Hamid. So thank you. Barry, will you please start the presentation?
Yes, I will. Thanks. And just to confirm, everyone can hear me and see my screen, correct?
Yes.
Great, thanks. I'm just going to go to slideshow mode. And as Afsha said, I'm Barry Miller, the project manager on the consulting team for the Comprehensive Advanced Planning Initiative. And we'll be doing this presentation in several modules, and I'll be turning it over to Aaron to do the parking section, and then Stephanie will walk us through the inclusionary zoning slides. This is really meant to be a follow-on to a meeting that we had with Town Council in November, where we started a conversation about the tools that the town could use to facilitate affordable housing development. We are doing a deeper dive into some of those tools this evening. As the mayor mentioned, we'll start with just a few slides that provide some context for what we're doing, and then we're going to talk about regulatory constraints and options, specifically the 6 topics that have already been mentioned. Actually, I think we mentioned 5 topics. We're also going to talk about density bonus, but that's really more of an FYI. We are not suggesting any particular recommendation. It's more to inform the council and commission about what the density bonus, the state density bonus law is, and how it interfaces with inclusionary zoning. And then we have a final slide or 2 on our next steps. Let me just go back and say, for any members of the public who are watching, we welcome and encourage your email comments, and the address for any email that's sent on the project is here on the screen, makemoraga@moraga.ca.us. So again, to reiterate, this is part of a larger project, which is the Comprehensive Advanced Planning Initiative that includes all of the components that you see here on the screen: the housing element update, the rezoning of key parcels, which are necessary to achieve the regional housing needs allocation for Moraga, and then a focused update of the general plan, which is being done in 2 phases. We are in phase 1 right now, which are the amendments that we need to make both to comply with state law relating to safety and circulation, and also internal consistency with some of the changes that are going to be made through the housing element. We are also looking at a rezoning of the Bollinger Canyon study area, and we're preparing a program level environmental impact report that covers all of the actions listed above. And most of these tasks are underway right now in some level. This evening, we're really focusing on the first two bullets on this list, which are the housing element and the rezoning. So as Afshar said, this is rooted in the general plan. Although the general plan is now 20 years old, some of the statements in that plan still reflect the town's values and are still very relevant, more relevant than ever today. And that includes having quality housing options that are available for persons of different incomes, for the local workforce, and so on. Valuing the attractiveness of the community and its semi-rural setting, and also some of the more specific language in the general plan about creating a community focal point at the Moraga Center and encouraging mixed uses at the Ream Center that help to meet our regional housing need and respond to the low and moderate income needs of Moraga households. A quick recap on our community engagement. We like to include this in all of our presentations. This is an ongoing process. And at this point, we have closed the resident survey that was open for about 10 weeks. We did it. We crossed the 1,000 mark. We got 1,008 responses to the survey. And still have a survey open right now for St. Mary's College students that so far we've received 143 responses. And I want to emphasize that what I think at least is the richest part of the information we've collected through these surveys is the responses to the open-ended questions, which we'll be sharing in an appendix to the housing element. There's so much good information from the community about priorities, concerns, goals, and so forth for the future related to housing and really broader issues on the town itself that is included in this survey. At the last meeting with the town council, we talked about the Balancing Act program, and I think most of you have maybe tested this program. We've received, as of yesterday, 102 maps submitted by members of the public. I just want to point out that the company that does the Balancing Act software says that our participation rate is much higher than what is expected in a city. Oops, my screen just disappeared. Can you, let me just pull this back again. Not sure where it went. Okay.
We could still see it, Barry.
Is that right? Okay.
Now we can't, but we were able to.
Oddly enough, it just completely vanished from my screen.
It's just testing whether you have your presentation memorized.
Okay, we're back.
Yep, sir.
Thank you. Maybe it's a reminder that I should talk faster. Okay, so point being that we're doing very well on our participation rate with Balancing Act. There's 2 more days to take that Balancing Act survey for those who are interested on the Moraga Housing website. So I'm wanting to point out here that what we're doing this evening is really part of a broader task in the housing element that is an analysis of constraints to development in the town. And the state considers 2 categories of constraints. We have governmental constraints and we have non-governmental constraints. This evening, we're really focused on the governmental constraints and more specifically on our zoning constraints and some of the issues related to zoning standards, which include things like parking and height limits and densities and so forth. You can see here that there are other constraints that we need to analyze as part of this process, and we're doing that. Things like our processing times, what we require in the way of site improvements when a development comes in, any developer fees or impact fees that are unique to Moraga. And then on the non-governmental constraints, which are things we have less control over, but we may have some ability to mitigate, things like the price of land and the cost of construction and so forth. This is where you mitigate things like that if you have public land that may be available for development that can be sold, for example. So I'm going to turn it over now to Aaron, who's going to walk us through the first of the issues. We are going to go through all 6 of these and then answer questions at the end and then hear from the public and come back for discussion. So if Aaron, if you could walk us through the parking discussion, hopefully my slides will stay on. Thanks.
Thanks, Barry. So I get to go first and talk about everybody's favorite subject, parking. I just want to acknowledge up front, it's an intricate topic. There's a lot of details to it. We won't get into all of the details of parking, but we just wanted to provide a high-level snapshot of where Moraga is, particularly in comparison to some comparable jurisdictions nearby in terms of its parking requirements, and then how that relates to some of the development constraints and housing goals that Barry was talking about. And just to reiterate, there's really no single right answer for parking. It's really a balancing act. That wasn't a plan for what Barry just said previously, but it really is a balance. And so just wanted to throw some ideas out there for everybody to consider. So one of the reasons that it's included in the housing topic as a constraint, in addition to other topics that's related to like transportation or environmental issues or quality of life, is it really does provide frequently a constraint or a limitation on development feasibility because of the cost of parking. And so it depends on the project and the type of parking, but generally a structured parking space can range anywhere from $25,000 to $50,000 per space. There was a national study by WGI in 2021 that found the median price per space in the Bay Area of $33,359, which is the second highest in the country after New York City. So the cost of parking tracks with the cost of housing, which we also know is one of the highest in the country here in the Bay Area. And so for that reason, it's an important consideration in housing cost and feasibility because the money that goes into paying for a parking space is passed on to whoever purchases or rents the space, generally speaking, and it impacts the pro forma. So that's why we think about it as related to housing and housing cost. The summary of Moraga's parking standards is that the town currently requires 2 covered spaces per dwelling unit, regardless of unit type. So single family, multifamily, different sizes of units within multifamily all require 2 covered spaces with one exception that I'll mention. In addition, there is a 0.5 space per unit requirement for guest parking. Again, with one exception I'll mention. Planning Commission can reduce that with findings through a process, but it's not a standardized process. I'll mention also that a little more detail on this in a second, but state law preempts some of these parking requirements in certain instances, as it is doing with many other topics, as you know. So ADUs, 100% affordable projects, state density bonus projects sometimes have overriding limitations on what parking a local jurisdiction can require. So keep that in mind. Next. Okay, so here's our sort of like grand summary table for you to meditate on for a bit. This was in the staff report as well. What we wanted to do is just provide a snapshot of parking requirements in comparable jurisdictions. So, you know, some people may quibble with who we picked to consider comparable, but we went for semi-rural, smaller, more suburban, more rural contexts. So you won't see the urban contexts of Oakland and Berkeley and even Walnut Creek in here. So we looked at places like Lafayette, Danville, Livermore, Los Gatos, Los Altos, Healdsburg, and just a few I guess summary points that we think we're seeing in this table. One is the single family requirements for parking. Generally, the requirement for 2 spaces per unit, which Moraga has, is similar to most of the other towns we looked at. Some are a little higher, like Orinda, Santa Rosa. Some are a little, I guess we're two is the lowest. Livermore can go a little lower in some circumstances. So that's, I'd say, right near the median of the comparable jurisdictions we looked at. One, if you look to the, I guess, 3rd, 4th, and 5th columns for multifamily apartment requirements, one difference or one trend we saw that I think is common is that many jurisdictions prorate their requirements by number of bedrooms, so by unit size. And so what you see is a studio or a one bedroom, the requirement would be a little lower to reflect the lower occupancy. And for a 2 bedroom plus, it would be a little higher to reflect the higher occupancy. Now, this is not a rule. It doesn't happen everywhere. So there are places like Santa Rosa or Hillsburg. There was one more in there, Los Gatos, that does not do this. It requires a multifamily requirement across the board, regardless of unit size, although like in the case of Los Gatos, it's a little lower than the single family. But the point being that these other jurisdictions do prorate it by size. And so that's something to consider. One of the rationales, again, is that the smaller unit sizes have lower occupancy and therefore less vehicle demand. The exception to that, so Moraga does not do that. Moraga has 2 spaces required regardless of multifamily, single family, and then regardless of unit size within the multifamily. There's one exception to that, which is in the R20 zone currently, which is the multifamily residential zone in the Moraga Center specific plan area. The requirement is prorated. So for studios and 1 bedrooms, projects are required to provide 1 space per unit. And then for 2-bedroom apartments and larger, it's 2 spaces per unit. So that's currently on the books in Moraga. There are no other zones where that is the case, but we sort of have a mix going on in Moraga currently. So there's also guest parking. I won't get too much into that, but Moraga's guest parking requirement is slightly higher than the median, I would say, of what we looked at. But the range when we looked around was anywhere from 0.2 to 0.5, which is in Moraga. The exception, again, being in R20, there's no guest parking requirement. All right. That'll be the slide I spend the longest on, but I think there's some good data there for you all to consider. I said I would speak to state law, so density bonus. If there's a density bonus project, it can override local jurisdictions' parking requirements. So again, just keep this in mind. Regardless of what we do, there are instances where state law will override. So density bonus project, you can't require more than 1 space for studios and 1 bedrooms, 1.5 for 2 and 3s, or 2.5 for 4 bedrooms. That's the law. And then in addition, there are special types of projects where you can't require parking at an even lower rate. Most of the major transit, I think, does not apply to Moraga, but things like rental senior, 100% affordable within a half mile of a bus route, if they request it, can go down to 0 spaces. And there are other special types of projects as well. So whether we like it or not, that is the law. And we don't know if projects will invoke the law, but that's the state law. Next. Okay, so I talked about just base parking ratios and requirements, which is the starting point for when you talk about parking in zoning. Many jurisdictions also look at parking reductions and tying any parking reductions, or not any, but some types of parking reductions to further strategies that reduce demand for parking. And so this is just a laundry list of typical types of either requirements, incentives, some blend of those 2 that jurisdictions might offer or require. I guess in the first bucket would be certain types of development, such as senior housing, affordable housing, student housing. We know, not always, but as a trend, tend to have lower car ownership and therefore less parking demand, and that's based on studies by Institute of Transportation Engineers and others. So inherent to the project, there can be features that tend to create less parking demand. Additionally, adding things like bike facilities, pedestrian facilities, or accessibility to transit, either things like transit passes or just being near it, can reduce demand for parking. And then actual features in the parking design, such as shared parking between uses that have different peak periods, car share, bike share, or if you have an employer, things like shuttles and carpool. So again, there's a lot of ways this could play out, but many jurisdictions, and I'd say this is an increasing trend, have either incentives or requirements for some of these features that lead to reduced parking requirements. Next. Okay, so just to be kind of painfully clear, this is not intended to be a example from Moraga per se. This is just saying of all these how these things could come together in an example town, and how this works in many towns. There's the base requirement for parking. In a multifamily project, let's say it has 40 units. If you have 8 of those units as studios, and if you had the requirement of 1 space per unit, that would mean 8 required spaces, and so on. You would then add that up to the total number of spaces needed. This is just how the ratios are applied by planning departments around the Bay Area and other places. And you end up with 66 parking spaces, including the guest parking also. And every town has a different way of doing this, but this is the basic approach most towns and cities take. If the town chose to require or incentivize transportation demand management or parking reduction strategies, they might do something like, say, you get an additional 5% reduction for car sharing, for bike parking, therefore requiring 6 fewer spaces and only requiring 60 in total. Again, I'm not saying this is how it should be or is. It's just an example of how TDM requirements or incentives are layered onto the base parking in many, many towns for your consideration. Next. Okay, so I'll stop there. Our recommendation, based on what we looked at, is for you to consider updating the parking standards for studio 1 and 2 bedroom apartments in multifamily contexts, similar to what we currently see in the R20 zone and in many other towns. We'd like to hear your feedback and discussion about that. The guest parking requirement in Moraga is currently a little higher than many comparable jurisdictions, so we would love to hear your feedback on consideration of reducing those, maybe in line with other comparable jurisdictions. And then the third recommendation is to consider some sort of standard process for parking reductions through TDM measures. Again, that could look a number of ways, and that could be crafted based on your feedback, but something that's a little more standard versus just based on the Planning Commission discretionary process. So those are the 3 recommendations for you all to consider that we'd love to hear your feedback on, and we appreciate your time.
Aaron, would you be okay with addressing any questions that commissioners or council members have about the parking topic right now, so when it's fresh in people's minds?
I'll defer to Barry. I know we have 6 topics to get through, so I don't want to sidetrack us and not get through the others. On the other hand, if there's a clarifying question or two, maybe we could take a few of those. What do you think?
Well, this would be in lieu of waiting till the end to have everyone ask their questions about every topic.
Yeah, and I would also defer to Afshan, the town manager, on this. I would say that if we do that for this topic, we don't necessarily have to do it for every topic.
Agree.
This is a meatier topic than the next 2 that are coming up in some respects.
I agree, Barry. That's why I thought this might be one we pick off right now.
Right.
Does that work for you, Afshan? Does this work for you?
I'm okay with that. Thank you.
Okay, I see hands raised already, so, and then we'll take public comment on this at the end. Vice Mayor.
Hey, Mayor, clarifying question. There was reference to proximity to major transit. Can you define what that major transit is? Are we talking about BART, or does that also include buses that run through Moraga once every hour and 15 minutes?
So the formal definition is buses with a headway of 15 minutes or more. So there'd be nothing in Moraga that qualifies as major transit stop.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Nick.
Thank you, Mayor, and I like the idea of pausing while it's fresh, so I appreciate that. I have 2 questions. If memory serves from the last presentation that Mr. Miller gave, student housing, that's not allowed to be counted as part of our RENA allocation. Is that correct?
It depends.
I'm not remembering that.
Under certain circumstances, student housing can be counted if there are apartments and if other people besides students are eligible to live there, such as faculty or staff members or the public. If it's a dormitory or simply apartment suites that are only for students, then it would be difficult to count those units.
Got it. But if it were exclusive to someone with a relation to St. Mary's, then that would be fine.
If it was housing for St. Mary's faculty, students, and their families, yes. If it was just student housing for, for people who are enrolled as students, then it would not count.
Got it. Thank you. And one other question. Have any municipalities tried to let the market determine what parking allocation should be? It seems to me that if someone's going to build housing, they're going to need to provide amenities, parking being one of them. So is anyone that just said, let's let the market decide what should be built?
Yes, I would say that has happened. Generally, what cities will do is either institute a parking maximum or no parking requirement at all. I wouldn't say it's extremely common, but there are cities, generally the bigger cities, generally the urban cities, that have taken that approach just to stay out of it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Carl, question about parking?
Yep. Mr. Welch, I assume you had a chance to look at my comments I sent in on Monday.
We did. I don't think we have answers for every single question you'll have, but we'd love to hear what questions you may have.
So I want to start with the statement in your report, or portion of the report, that says our 50-year standard is out of date. I'm going to agree with you on that. When we wrote that 50-year standard, 67% of America had one or fewer cars. In 2017, 45% had one or fewer cars, and 55% had two or more. In our area, car ownership is significantly higher than the national average. Why are we putting forward a plan that assumes we need fewer cars in the town of Moraga, for car parking spaces in the town of Moraga?
Aaron, did you want to respond? I can respond also if you like.
Sure. Why don't you start?
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Davis. It's a good point, and we did look at the car ownership rates in Moraga, and they are indeed higher than they were 50 years ago. I think where we're saying they're out of date is really more about the fact that we require the same number of spaces for a studio as we do for a 2 or 3 bedroom house, and that most communities have changed their standards to have variable rates of parking depending on the number of bedrooms in the unit. And I don't know that we have data on car ownership among studios. There frankly aren't that many studios in Moraga and 1 bedrooms, but in most communities that number of cars per unit would be lower in those. So I think what we're saying here simply is to modify the standards to be more responsive to the bedroom count.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you about your bedroom count relative to the number of persons we can assume live in those bedrooms. As an undergraduate student, I lived in a 4-bedroom house with 13 people. Not unusual, frankly, and not unusual at St. Mary's, where students tend not to have much money. Bedroom count is actually a really poor reflection of population. A 4-bedroom house probably only has 4 or 5 people in it. A 2-bedroom flat in this town typically has far more than 2. Assuming that any 2-bedroom or even 1-bedroom unit in this town has 2 adults in it, given that nobody works in this town for the most part who lives here, both of them are commuting. And they're not commuting on the bus, and they're not commuting on the BART, and they're probably not bicycling up to Concord. The argument that a 1-bedroom apartment needs only 1 parking space is fallacious. It doesn't match who we are. It doesn't match where we are. And I would ask how you came to a conclusion that we don't need 2 parking spaces per unit, not bedroom, 2 parking spaces per unit, because it's the extra space and those occasional 1-bedroom units with only 1 car that takes care of the third car and some of our two-bedroom units and two-car spaces. So how does the math work from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that, in communities that are setting parking standards can do more detailed studies to look at what those standards can be based on parking surveys and inventories of existing units and so forth. What we're saying here is only that the standards for Moraga for studios and one bedrooms are substantially higher than they are in most comparable communities. I think that's really the only point that we're trying to make here, and I respect that you disagree with that.
I do, yes, sir. But I also see from the data you presented earlier, or Mr. Welch did, that in fact, we're not substantially higher than anybody. We do have two parking spaces per studio apartment, and I would agree with you. 2 spaces for a studio apartment is probably not realistic or necessary. It's not evil, but it's not necessary. The other point I would ask is how many people, let's pick a 1-bedroom apartment in this town. How many people do you think would live in a 1-bedroom apartment that was ultra low income in this town? Given that the only reason anybody would choose to live in this town, other than any other town typically, is for the schools.
Well, I'm not prepared to answer that right now. I think what I would say is that affordable units generally are, the tenants and occupants are screened very carefully, so that you would not have the incidence of overcrowding that you might in a market rate unit where there is no application process that you go through in the same way that you would for an affordable unit. So it wouldn't necessarily be the affordable units that are generating that. It could be the market rate units where that's the issue.
It could be, you're right. I've been a subtenant a couple of times in my life, so it does happen. So anyway, I will leave off. I think I've made my point, and I appreciate your patience.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Graham, questions about parking?
Graham, if you're talking, I don't think your audio is on.
Graham, can you hear us? Graham? I don't think he can hear.
Just fumbling for the mute button. My apologies.
Oh, no worries. Glad
okay.
you're still with us. Okay.
Yeah, I had audio issues yesterday. Now I have a computer hooked up and a phone hooked up. So hopefully there's no audio issues, just my coordination issues. I'd say just brief question on the guest parking requirements. Any information why this is higher in Moraga, just historically?
I don't know if we found a reason, but I think
Okay.
that's been on the books for as long back as we looked.
Gotcha. Okay. And then, go ahead.
Most of our code is adopted from when we were part of the county. So, there haven't really been comprehensive updates. We've been doing some updates, but parking is an area that we need to look at, especially as we're moving forward with long-term policies. And we want to look comprehensively with how parking and our policies for Moraga Center and Ream area can align.
Gotcha. Thanks for that. That makes sense. In regards to student housing or senior housing, say if it was off-campus student housing, but would there be a reduced ratio for either of those two housing types?
I think that's what we wanted feedback on. We, as Barry said, really wanted to focus on the studios and the 1-bedrooms, and then the question is exactly which ones. Ream Center, would it be other multifamily? I think that's for something for you to consider.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I look forward to the suggestions provided as we go forward on what those parking or reduced parking might be for student and senior. Similar to Commissioner Davis's concerns on evaluating bedroom count for the studios as well too. And then just my understanding, we don't have any neighborhood parking restrictions or areas with parking meters in town of Moraga. Is that correct?
That's correct. We don't have any meters in town.
Gotcha. So arguably, if we did have certain parking requirements or reduction in parking requirements, there's ample opportunity to park on the street in certain neighborhoods without, say, neighborhood restrictions and or parking meter restrictions. Not really a question, more just a comment.
But I just want to make sure that we're clear that we're not talking about residential neighborhoods right today, right? This is about multifamily, mixed use areas.
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
thank you, thank you. Okay, are you done, Graham? Do you have any other
Yes,
questions about
thank you.
parking? Okay, thank you for
Appreciate
your
it.
questions. Marcus, questions about parking?
Yes, I'll keep it quick. The table one, I think that's great. I like how you laid it out. I do have a question. I noticed that there's 4 green bars for Orinda, Danville, Los Gatos, and Corte Madera. And I may have missed you mentioning that, but do the green bars, do they have to, or what do they have to deal with? And then is it related to the feedback that you got from the developer interviews? Because I see a correlation between what they suggested and kind of what Orinda, Danville, Los Gatos have out there.
Could you clarify the green bars that you're referring to?
Sure. In
In the staff report?
Yeah, in the staff report on table
Sorry,
one, there's 4 green bars. And I was just curious if that was, oh, hey, I want you guys to pay attention to this and here's why.
No, I'm sorry. That's probably a bad, just.
It's
Formatting.
formatting. It's just a formatting
It's an
thing.
Excel table where it alternates color. So that probably
Okay,
should not have been there.
All right. Because Healdsburg at the bottom wasn't following the same formatting. Okay.
Sorry.
That being said, well, it did draw my eyes to certain things, so that was good. Feedback from the developer interviews, is that, maybe you can walk us through that a little bit about the process you went through.
Sure. I mean, I think the conclusion was that parking can impact feasibility, and Afsha, maybe you have more, I guess, specific anecdotes or instances from those interviews.
Yeah, so we did talk to developers, developers set of city ventures who do much larger projects. And then we also spoke to developers who do smaller projects who are more local developers, actually, that's the way to put it, who do projects in towns similar to Moraga. And what they are finding is that parking is one of the areas that they are actually seeking reduction on, because parking is not only expensive, but it also takes up real estate. So often that real estate for parking is competing against the number of units that they can put in. They also commented on our guest parking requirements and that was high as compared to what they were experiencing in other similar towns. So we listened to the developers, but we also did our own research, independent research, and we spoke to the local jurisdiction staff. At local jurisdictions, we also did our survey. And what we found is that Table 1 is the current parking standards, but both Danville and Lafayette are looking at some additional flexibility in parking and reductions in parking.
Okay, thank you.
Does that answer your question, Marcus?
It does indeed. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Carrie, thank you for waiting patiently.
Of course, and Director Hamid partially answered the question that I wanted to ask, which is all of these jurisdictions' parking requirements on page 6 and 7 of the staff report are reflective of now, but all of these communities are also facing the same RENA allocation scenario that we are. So I'm wondering how many, if we have data on how many of these are reevaluating their parking requirement and whether or not they were choosing to lessen or potentially increase what they currently allocate for parking by bedroom.
The ones that we more closely spoke to were Danville and Lafayette and Orinda. And we know that Orinda's housing element is already out, but we know that Danville and Lafayette are currently looking at additional standards, not just parking, but also additional standards. And they're still in the process of getting to, their draft housing elements. So they're still in the process, like we are today, of discussing policies with their council members and planning commission members. So we don't have anything affirmative yet.
I would add, if there is a regional trend, it's for the requirements to be going down, not up, particularly for these multifamily downtown studio 1-bedroom locations. I would say that is a regional trend.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to point out that there was a slide that Aaron had that showed the density bonus parking requirements. And so projects that use the state density bonus are automatically eligible for different standards than the other. They don't have to follow the local standards, essentially. They use the state density bonus standards, even for the market rate units.
All right, thank you. Teresa, questions about parking?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Barry and Aaron. This is great. My question is, and I don't know how you would do this, but did you look at MCC, because they have guest parking, and I know Alta Mesa area has guest parking, and there's a few other areas dotted around town that have guest parking because they have limited parking. Like in MCC, I know they're not supposed to have their cars out, they're supposed to have them in their garage. And like most people in Moraga, at least us, we have a 3-car garage and you'd be hell-bent on getting a car in there. So, but I was wondering if you had the opportunity, or if you took the opportunity to talk to MCC or local areas, and what was their experience with guest parking?
That's a great suggestion. We really focused on multifamily housing ratios as our metric or category we were looking at, but I think non-residential, employer-based institutions, and St. Mary's in particular is a really good idea to ask their experience.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mike?
Okay, thank you. First question, did you solicit feedback from residents on your suggestion for reduced parking?
So the survey that we put out, I think, offers ideas for making housing more affordable, and parking may have been listed there. I know that there were concerns in the open-ended comments about parking impacts of changes. There were concerns about building on the parking lots at Ream Center. Where would people park if there wasn't parking? So we're hearing concerns about parking. Absolutely, I think that's accurate. We didn't specifically go out and ask, about parking in individual neighborhoods and so forth.
Right. Okay. Thank you. My next question actually relates to what you're talking about. So we're talking here about parking standards for housing, but in our centers, we have housing, we have retail, we have office, we have commercial. Have we done any work that says, with the plans we have, the additional units that we want to rezone and what we're proposing here, does it all fit at the end of the day? Because I think that's an important consideration. This is one piece of the total pie. And as you said, Barry, people were saying, well, wait a minute, if you're going to take up parking in the Moraga Center, where are we going to park? And the people that live there, well, they could walk, but the other 17,000 that don't live there, and they want to go to the new retail and the new commercial and the new office, they need parking. So have we looked at that holistically?
I think you would look at that on a case-by-case basis for individual projects and require a parking study for any project that's going to displace a parking lot that's used for an adjacent business. I think it's really kind of place sensitive, and you'd need to really look at the context of each development. The place I would be most focused on would be the Ream Center, any housing that's built there, but it could have structured parking to replace the surface parking, and that's where we come back to the issue of height, because if you do 2 stories, it may not work as well as 3 stories, and that the equations have to be considered there.
Okay, thank you.
And can I just ask a favor of panelists who are not speaking to please go to mute so that we eliminate background noise. Okay, anybody who hasn't had a chance to ask a question, who wants to ask a question about parking? Okay, Nick, I see you have another question about parking?
Well, it's more of a macro level question, but since it was brought up about the developer interviews, did we talk to the current landowners, since they're the ones that are going to build this? We know what their opinion is around parking.
Yes, actually, we did speak to the landowner at Ream, and we've also been having conversations with the landowner for Moraga Center. So I did make both landowners aware of tonight's meeting and invited them to tonight's meeting. The landowner for Ream specifically has shared some early concepts with us, and based on, I just ran some back of the envelope numbers based on what we're proposing tonight as our recommendation with what they are doing. And with the reduced parking standards and a combination of the TDM strategies, it would work with the concepts that they're proposing. Of course, there's also, I want to point out that there's also shared parking. So that's already in our code in Moraga Center. And we could look to apply it to Ream Center as well.
Thank you. Sona.
Thank you. You actually just touched on the question that I have, which is about shared parking, because it doesn't seem like that's really considered as a viable option. If we reduce it, then we're also reducing the amount of shared spaces. I guess I'm just not understanding like shared parking as a concept and then how a reduction impacts that.
I can speak to the basic concept. Obviously, in different places, it could all be worked in different ways. It needs to be balanced in different ways. But the basic concept is saying that if you have multiple uses, particularly different types of uses, and particularly ones that have different peak periods of use, that there's a rationale for sharing not all the spaces, but a certain percentage of the spaces between those uses. And so a classic example would be like an evening theater sharing some spaces with a daytime retail shopping area. And people that tend to visit there in the daytime go to the shopping and in the evening go to the theater. That's a small scale example. So it could be shared between non-residential uses, different types of shopping. And often this happens informally already in most shopping centers, actually. Even if they have formal lease agreements, there is some amount of sharing that happens, whether or not they like it or not, or formalize it or not. So there's some element of that in non-residential spaces. And then I would say a slightly more complicated example is between non-residential and residential uses. That can get into more complicated issues of access and privacy and probably a little more difficult to regulate. But that is another example where the peak use for something like a workplace would be daytime, whereas something like a residential would be nighttime. And so there's some percentage of the parking that could be shared between the same uses if they're right next to each other.
Thank you. All right. Okay, I don't see any more raised hands. Barry,
Okay.
Next topic. Thank you for indulging us. I think it was helpful to.
No worries at all. No, that's great.
Thank you all.
Okay, we'll go back to where we left off. And back to full screen. Okay. So we're talking now about density and floor area ratio. And just to reiterate, density is what we are used to seeing, which is expressed as the number of units per acre. And this is the standard that's been used not only in Moraga, but in most of the other suburban communities actually all around the country in their planning and zoning applications. The state of California uses density to specify that a site may only be considered suitable for lower income, to be counted for as a lower income opportunity site if it's zoned for at least 20 units per acre in a community with fewer than 25,000 residents. So we're used to density. So why are we considering floor area ratio? So first, what is floor area ratio? I think most of you are familiar that it is the ratio of building square footage that's permitted on a site to lot area on a site. So floor area ratio actually doesn't regulate the number of units in a building. It simply regulates the square footage of the building that can be placed on a property. And it's sometimes used in places where residential and commercial uses are both permitted on the same site. So, for example, in commercial areas, in downtown areas where we allow housing, where we envision maybe ground floor restaurants or retail or commercial uses with housing above, floor area ratio is often used in that context. And it's being used by an increasing number of communities for a couple of reasons, which I'll go over on the next slide. But again, just in terms of how it works, if we have an acre of land that is zoned 24 units per acre, we know what we're going to get. We're going to get 24 units. If that same piece of land has a floor area ratio of 1, all we know is we're going to get 43,560 square feet of space. That's the square footage of an acre. That could be 21 units that are 2,000 square foot each, or it could be 60 units that are 700 square foot each. So it provides much greater flexibility to a property owner or developer in terms of the unit mix and the yield. And it tends to favor smaller units. So when we look at the pros and cons, the pros of density is that it's predictable. We know how many units we're going to get. We're familiar with it. We have a state density bonus program. We know what 20% equals when you're looking at density and so forth. If you're applying a density bonus, the disadvantages of density is that it often gives us larger units and limits the number of units on a site. It doesn't account for commercial square footage, so it may be less of a good tool to use in commercial and mixed use districts. And you can see the advantages of floor area ratio, primarily that it's flexible and that it does provide this incentive for smaller units. So the disadvantage of FAR is that it may lead to larger projects. The state doesn't like to see FARs that are less than 1. So on those sites that are larger, we could potentially get larger projects if we shift to a floor area ratio metric. We wanted to give you an example, and this is from the town of Danville. This is 600 Harts Avenue. For those who have ever dined at Faz Restaurant on Harts in downtown Danville, this is a district that has no density limit, but it does have a floor area ratio limit. And in that context, the Faz site was proposed for redevelopment with a mixed use project where there will be on the 1.2 acre site, a building that is about 52,000 square feet, about 50,000 square feet, plus subterranean parking that's not included in the FAR calculation. And that includes roughly 33 units of housing. It includes 33 units of housing because the property owner wanted to subdivide that 47,200 square feet into 33 units, not because there was a density limit that said that that was the capacity of that property. So this is just an example, and you can see that at 0.96 FAR, that developer was able to achieve 2.5 to 3 story product that's equivalent to about 30 units per acre. So this is comparable in many respects to what we might see here in Moraga. So our recommendation at this time is to continue to use density in the MCSP and REAM areas. I think the concept of floor area ratio is intriguing and something that the town would continue to explore in the future. If we are not seeing the kinds of developments that we want, and if we're getting projects that are well below the capacity of our sites, we might look at switching to FAR during the planning period and coming back to the Commission and Council with a recommendation in the future on switching to FAR. But for now, we're proposing to continue to use density as the metric for the REAM Center area. At this point, there is another module on height, and I'm thinking maybe I can just go through this. It's also about 3 or 4 slides and maybe take a pause. Is that Does that sound
Yeah,
okay?
Barry, I mean, if it makes sense to you, I think the next two are all related. So I'm wondering if we should just march through the next two modules.
Inclusionary is a little bit longer.
Okay,
That's,
all right, then certainly the next one.
Great. Yeah, Stephanie's going to do that one as well.
Okay.
So this is building height limits. It's another topic of conversation. And we heard from our developers that we interviewed that this is a regulatory constraint in many communities, particularly where we have 35-foot height limits in areas where the desired product is ground floor residential and housing above. So that's basically a 3-story building with 1 story that's retail and 2 stories that are housing. So you can see here the current height limits in the different zones we've been looking at. We have a 45 height limit in R20 and in the MCSP mixed use zones, but then a 35 foot height limit in the zones where residential uses are currently not permitted. So that's really the distinction in the existing zoning code, is that 45 feet is allowed in the zones where housing is allowed, and 35 feet is the limit in the exclusively commercial zones. So as we're thinking about allowing residential in suburban office and in a new mixed-use district for the Reams Center, we are proposing that 45 feet be allowed in the in those 2 zoning districts. That would be for mixed-use projects and for multifamily residential projects. The commercial projects in that zone, any future commercial development would still be subject to a 35-foot limit. So this would only be applicable to multifamily and mixed use. And again, just for context, some examples, these are all from Lafayette. We have a 35-foot project on the left, it's 3 stories. There's a proposed project in downtown Lafayette in the center where you can see that they're going up from a 35-foot height limit to 45 feet. And on the right, you can see their town center project in Lafayette, which is 55 feet or roughly 5 stories in height. At this point, we're not talking about that level of height. The recommendation, again, to recap, is to consider 45 feet in the community commercial and suburban office zones to for mixed use and multifamily. This would align these zones with the MCSP. And I will stop there before we go into inclusionary. And Mayor Sauce, I think you're on mute.
At the far side, blah, 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 Ginger. I was inviting questions about height or the density versus FAR topic. Carl.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for that presentation, Mr. Miller. I appreciate the recommendation that we would study FAR further. That's a terrible pun in that, but I'm going to leave that alone. It does seem like a combination of FAR and our current approach could yield a predictable and optimal both outcome. Is anybody doing a blend?
Yes.
Of DUAs and FAR?
Actually, a blend of DUAs and FAR is pretty common, I would say.
Okay.
Yes. And the question there is, do you count the housing in the floor area, or do you exclude the housing from that calculation?
All right, thank you. That's the 2 different purposes of commercial, or perhaps the 3 different commercial offices and housing are distinct and clear enough that doing something for one and something else for the other seems sensible, even if they're in the same location. I was just curious. Thank you.
You're muted, Renata.
You'd think I had enough practice at this. Thank you. Mike, please, question.
All right, thank you. Yes, on building height, the 2 proposed to 45 feet. Is it not true that if we did agree to that, somebody can come in with inclusionary housing, qualify for a density bonus, and in that case, with the density bonus, what's the maximum height they could achieve?
There's no specified maximum. They would basically be entitled to whatever height they need to build their project with the additional units included. So it's not as though they would get 10 feet or 20 feet or some specified number. They would basically say, with the additional density that we're allowed, we need this much additional height in order to make our project work. And we have a couple of slides on that coming up. I'll just give you a sneak.
Okay, so I guess the point is 45 feet can easily become, let's just say 55 feet. And you sort of said, well, we're not talking about 55 feet, but we are really. So that is potentially on the board, and I will wait for future slides. Thank you.
Thank you.
Steve, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mayor. Two quick questions, hopefully. So if we go straight density and you're in a mixed residential commercial, how do you handle the commercial side of it? If, you know, the density is really specific to the residential piece of it, how do you handle that?
Yeah, you're actually handling it now in the MCSP zoning. You have two separate standards that apply. You have a standard for the commercial, which is whatever in MCSP in the districts that we've been looking at, it's 0.85. And that's your FAR for your commercial. And then you have your 24 or your 20 units per acre, whatever that number is for your residential, and they're additive. So you have two different standards and you add them together to figure out your building envelope. And that's essentially what you're doing now and what many communities do.
So just confirming then, my understanding is that's sort of what's being proposed for Ream?
It is, yes.
So that's kind of tied to, I think, the question that Carl was getting to. And then on building height, you know, if we go to 45 feet, do we have the capability to essentially restrict that to areas set back from Moraga Road and Ream Boulevard to avoid, you know, the large, massive building right adjacent to the road?
Yes, you absolutely can do that. That's a discretionary decision that you would make during the setting when we prepare the objective standards for the zone. You can say that 45 feet is permitted, either draw a map or adopt a map that says in this area, it's 45 feet, in this area, it's 35 feet. Or you can say, you set the parameters in the text of the zone where each of those height limits would apply. But yes, you can have variable heights within a single zone.
Okay, thank you.
Mike.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot my other question, which was when we went through the Moraga Center plan, the idea of setbacks as you go up every story, not set back from a road, but a step back from from the beginning, if I'm being clear. Is that a possibility to lessen, if we did have a 55-foot high building, to lessen the impact?
Yes, you could adopt step back standards. And just to clarify the difference between a setback and a step back, setback is how far the building is from the property line. A step back says that when you reach a certain height on the building front, you have to pull the building in and basically allow for, you terrace the building in effect so that it casts less shadow and it appears to be lower from the street. You don't really see that fourth story or whatever may be up above a certain level. So yes, you can do that.
Is that contemplated in here? And if not, is that something that we could? And be curious what others think.
So yeah, we haven't proposed any specific design details at this point. It's really, I think, and that is part of why we're here now, is to hear ideas like that.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Nick?
In the staff report, you referenced the hill behind Ream Center. Do you happen to know how tall that is, and how high can we push the limit in order to not impact that view corridor there?
I don't believe we have the elevation of that hill. Anybody on the screen happen to know what the height of that ridge line is?
At least 200 feet. It's pretty high.
Mhm.
Agree.
And is it the consultants in the town's vision that that a redevelopment of that center and the existing retail? I mean, we obviously can't dictate what happens, but is it our vision that frankly gets scraped, we get new retail under residential? Is that what we're trying to go for here?
That was the discussion at the last meeting that we had on zoning options. So I think that is anticipated.
Okay. Yeah, because I know this is not comment time, but it seems like that's a prime area to really get significant density without impacting the semi-rural feel of our town.
Yes, and that is in our general plan as well. Those are the two areas that our general plan focuses on, are Ream and Moraga Center. And in our discussions, again, these are conceptual and we haven't really seen an application yet. But those are the kinds of things that the applicant at Ream is looking at.
You good, Nick? Okay, great, thank you. Any other questions? I have one. Barry, so one can stay with density and then add FAR either in an overlay way or in lieu of. Can you do the opposite? Can you start with FAR and go back to density if it's not working?
Sure, you can do that. I think then the question is, where do we set the FAR? So we would need to decide, is it 1, is it 1.2, is it, and what can we expect to see if we set it at a certain metric? What is the building form we're likely to see? How many units do we think we're going to get? It's a little bit trickier with the state, I will say, for the housing element when you're using FAR, because you have to basically make the case that whatever you choose as your FAR is going to produce the number of units and the densities that they want to see in your housing element. So,
okay, thank you. And you, one of the cons of the FAR approach that was identified is it makes it difficult to calculate density bonuses. How difficult is it? I mean, because it made my head explode, but there must be a way to do it.
There is. I've done that in another community, and the way you do it is you calculate the square footage of building space that you can build on the site, and then you basically apply your density bonus in square feet to that envelope and convert that to units. So if you can build a 40,000 square foot building and you get a 50% density bonus, that's another 20,000 square feet that you get on your building. So now you have a 60,000 square foot building, and you still have to provide the whatever the number of density bonus units would be.
Okay, so it's just on a square footage basis then?
Right.
Got it. Okay.
You have to assume the same unit size for across the board. That's the trick to make sure that it's apples to apples.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
All right, any other questions on height or density versus FAR? Okay, seeing none, shall we move on to inclusionary zoning?
Yes, and I'm going to introduce Stephanie Hagar from BAE Urban Economics to take this item. Let's just bring the slide up. Okay, Stephanie.
Right, thanks, Barry. Excuse me, thanks, Barry. Okay, so I'll start off with just a quick overview of inclusionary zoning. An inclusionary housing ordinance is an ordinance that requires that a certain percentage of units in future residential developments be made affordable. Barry's going to be talking a little bit more about density bonus in a few minutes, but just to draw a distinction between density bonus and inclusionary requirements. An inclusionary housing requirement is a mandatory requirement on new development, whereas a density bonus is something that developers opt into. They basically choose to provide affordable housing in order to get certain incentives for their development project. Inclusionary housing is fairly common in California. There are over 170 jurisdictions in the state that have them. We've listed some that are near you that have some kind of inclusionary ordinance. And they're at times a tool that jurisdictions use to try to get the units that are called for in their RHNA allocations, particularly their very low income RHNA allocations, that they might not get otherwise without an inclusionary ordinance. So just to give a little brief overview of the economics of how inclusionary housing ordinances work, starting with a 100% market rate project. The general calculation to determine if a market rate residential project is feasible is to look at the total project value once the project is built, subtract out the development costs, and whatever's left over is the developer's profit. That developer profit needs to meet a certain threshold for a developer to decide that the project is worth going after, that it's a financially feasible project, and that they want to pursue that project. So when a developer is considering looking at a project site and trying to figure out whether or not they want to develop, they'll take into account all of the various factors that apply to that site in terms of development standards, what they think rents or sale prices would be, and prepare a financial pro forma to assess whether or not they think that this project will result in that profit margin that they're seeking from a new development. The value of the project is based on the market. So by that we mean for a rental project, it's based on the market rate rents in the area. For a for sale project, it would be based on the sale prices that would be applicable to the units, the specific types of units in the project. So that's set by market demand for a 100% market rate project. The total development cost consists of hard costs, which is building materials and labor, soft costs, which is things like city fees, CEQA, architecture, engineering, all the other kinds of costs that go along with development. And then there's the land cost. So when you add an inclusionary housing ordinance to this equation, if you change nothing else, that affects the project value. So you're either reducing a portion of the rents on the project by saying that a portion of the units in the project have to be affordable, or for a for sale project, you'd be reducing the sale income that you would get from the project because you're saying a portion of these units have to be sold for below market rate. What a lot of jurisdictions do is provide some incentives for projects that provide affordable units pursuant to an inclusionary housing ordinance or for other reasons that help to offset the impact of providing some units for below market rate. So this can be things like parking reductions. So, because the cost of parking is so high, if you lower the rents or sale prices that you can get from the unit and also allow for reduced parking, you're reducing both the project value, but also your total development costs, and you may still end up with that same sliver of developer profit that the developer is seeking from that project. The way that incentives can come into play can also get much more complicated than that. In some cases, you're getting a density bonus and you're getting additional value from having more units. You also are building a bigger project, which costs more money. And you may have a combination of incentives that both affect the project value and affect your development cost in various ways. The way that all shakes out in terms of the developer's decision about whether or not they want to pursue a project depends on how powerful the various incentives are related to the impacts of the inclusionary requirements, and then also various local factors. So, what are the rents locally? What specific things affect your development costs? Factors like that all sort of play into the pro forma in different ways. So usually there's sort of a balancing act of trying to figure out what kinds of incentives will be valuable in order to help offset some of these impacts of an inclusionary housing ordinance. One more thing, very sorry. So similar to the effect of incentives, if you do an upzoning while you are adopting an inclusionary housing ordinance, that can sort of function similarly to offering incentives because you're adding additional value to these sites that are getting upzoned at the same time that you're reducing some value because of the inclusionary housing ordinance, and so that can help offset the impacts of the ordinance. So now I'm going to go into some key policy considerations related to inclusionary housing ordinances. One of the big ones is the percent of units that are required to be affordable. So if you go through the process of adopting an inclusionary housing ordinance, you'll have to decide what that percentage is. If you set the requirements too high, that can impact the feasibility of new development. If that happens, you could end up in a situation where your inclusionary requirements impede the ability for market rate projects to go forward, and then that means that you get no market rate units, but also not the affordable units that you're trying to get out of adopting the inclusionary housing ordinance. On the other hand, if your requirements are very low, that can be a missed opportunity to get some affordable housing in new development. You're essentially leaving some potential for getting affordable housing on the table. And then another important consideration related to the percent of units that you're dedicating is that the state does have the authority to review your requirements specifically for rental inclusionary ordinances, if your requirement requires more than 15% low-income units. The main goal here from the state's perspective is to make sure that your inclusionary housing ordinance is not functioning as a constraint to market rate development in an undue manner. And then another consideration is alignment with state density bonus. I think Barry's going to walk through some examples on this in the next section, but there are, to the extent that your inclusionary ordinance requires developers to provide enough affordable units to be automatically eligible for either a density bonus or other incentives, concessions under the state density bonus law, developers who are complying with the inclusionary ordinance will automatically be eligible for those and will be likely to pursue them because they have to provide the affordable units anyway, so they might as well get their bonus. So, depending on how close your requirements align, you may see more density bonus projects as a result of adopting an inclusionary housing ordinance. Another important consideration is the depth of affordability. Some jurisdictions choose to ask for a mix of income levels, like some very low, some low, something along those lines, or just a single income level. Sometimes there's flexibility in how developers respond to inclusionary housing there's options for different levels of affordability that they can provide. And some jurisdictions also, again, you're using this to target their unmet RHNA needs. Another key consideration is what types of development you decide to apply an inclusionary housing ordinance to. So some jurisdictions apply an ordinance to just rental, just for sale. A lot do both rental and for sale. Some jurisdictions also choose to exclude just very specific product types that they believe should not be subject to an inclusionary housing ordinance. Okay, another big key policy consideration is in lieu fees and other alternative means of compliance with the ordinance. Under state law, jurisdictions that adopt an inclusionary housing ordinance are required to allow developers to comply through some other means of compliance other than providing units on site. The one that we see most often is payment of an in lieu fee. So this is when a developer says that they, instead of providing the units on site, they're going to pay a fee to the jurisdiction that the jurisdiction can then use to support other affordable housing activities. The in lieu fee opens up its whole own bucket of policy considerations to think about. So, one of the main ones that a lot of jurisdictions play with is whether you want to incentivize a fee payment or providing inclusionary units on site. Generally, if you set your fees high, you'll incentivize developers to provide inclusionary units within their projects because they don't want to pay the fee. If you set the fees low, you'll incentivize developers to pay the fee because that's cheaper than providing the units. There are various trade-offs between getting inclusionary units within your market rate projects versus getting units in 100% affordable development. And maybe I should back up here for a second and just say that generally the way in lieu fees are spent is to provide that money to an affordable housing developer who then puts it into a 100% affordable project using the funds from the city combined with other public sources to build a 100% affordable development. So, with an inclusionary ordinance, a lot of the sort of common trade-offs that are cited is that you are getting your affordable units mixed in with your market rate development, whereas with a 100% affordable development, you're getting them sort of in its own development, independent of market rate units. There's also trade-offs related to timing. So for an inclusionary housing ordinance, you're getting those units at the same time as when the rest of the project is built. Particularly in a community like Moraga, where you're not seeing a lot of development on an annual basis, your projects are maybe a little bit smaller scale. The fee revenue that you would get from any one project is generally not going to be enough to really do anything meaningful in terms of supporting a new project in the town. So that means that you're probably waiting for a while for fees from multiple projects to roll in before you can really use that money to finance anything in terms of getting a 100% affordable project or, potentially other programs that you might want to use your fee revenue for. So, in that time that you're waiting, the value of that money goes down with time. You are looking for an affordable housing developer who needs to find a site, get their project entitled, go through the construction process. So there's a big lag in between when you're getting your market rate project that generates the fees and when you're actually seeing your affordable units on the ground. On the other hand, in lieu fees can be a little bit more flexible in how you use them. So sometimes that's something that could be attractive. And when you have an in lieu fee, jurisdictions often like to make sure that it's periodically updated so that with time you're keeping your fee rates keeping up with market conditions. Other alternatives could include developing affordable units off-site, so not as part of the project, but in its own separate project. These are options that you could provide developers. Doing a land donation, and that land would be used for affordable housing development, or doing rehabilitation of existing units to make them affordable. And then I think this is it on the key policy considerations. So a few more things. Project size thresholds. Often jurisdictions will exempt projects under a certain size. This is usually meant to help prevent potential feasibility challenges for smaller projects, which are often sort of harder to make pencil. And so it often helps with reducing some of those impacts. There's also often a case where at a certain point, if you have, the percentage for your inclusionary requirements ends up being less than a unit if your project is very small. So say you have a 10% inclusionary requirement and you have a 5-unit project, your requirement would be for half of a unit. In a lot of cases, jurisdictions decide that in that case, they're not going to require these units. Often in those cases, there will be an in lieu fee for these smaller projects. So that's something that a lot of jurisdictions implement. There's another key policy consideration is the design of the inclusionary units compared to the market rate units. A lot of jurisdictions like to ask that the inclusionary units be identical to the market rate units and indistinguishable. In some cases, jurisdictions are a little bit more flexible on this. So we've seen jurisdictions that allow for, say, a single family development to accommodate its inclusionary requirements by doing a duplex or, potentially ADUs, various other types of development, rather than just other single family homes that are identical to the others. There are various issues to consider related to management and monitoring of the affordable units. So for a for-sale inclusionary program, there is a lot of monitoring that has to go into this in terms of when the units are resold. There's new income qualifying for the new buyer, and making sure that all of that process goes according to the goals of the inclusionary housing ordinance. There can also be issues with smaller rental projects that have a small number of inclusionary units that There may be challenges there for a property owner to say, do income qualifying and monitoring for a single unit. And likewise for the city to monitor that property and make sure that it can, that it's abiding by its commitments under the inclusionary housing ordinance. And then there are administrative components to think about for that monitoring. Likewise, for collection of in lieu fees, there is also an administrative component to that would need to be considered for how the town would administer those fees. That's sort of its whole own activity for the town to take on. And then finally, often inclusionary zoning requirements come along with a set of incentives. So this can be relaxed development standards, expedited permit processing, fee waivers, things to help that equation so that by adding on the inclusionary housing ordinance, you're offsetting that with some incentives. In a lot of cases, this can be done just by applying the California state density bonus to inclusionary projects. So you wouldn't necessarily need a whole new set of incentives to be adopted. It could be a case where you are relying on the state density bonus to provide the incentives that developers would be eligible for. And so staff's recommendation on this topic is to consider a 10 to 15% inclusionary requirement. And to provide flexibility in the income categories. So this could mean different requirements for rental and owner projects, and then also to encourage BMR units to be provided on site within a market rate project rather than pursue some of the other alternatives that might be available. And with that, I'll pause.
Barry, do you want to talk about the state density bonuses now, or?
Yeah, it might be logical for me to do that since they're really connected to the inclusionary. So if you don't mind, I'll just, and it'll take just a couple of minutes to go through these slides.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oops, we're back to that. Okay. Okay. Right. So the state density bonus program, as Stephanie mentioned, that would be applicable to inclusionary housing projects depending on the percentage of affordable units that you're going to require. And I think the key here is that under state law, projects that include affordable units are automatically eligible for bonuses, which effectively means they can add units above and beyond what zoning allows. The state also allows bonus units for senior housing and for certain populations, and I'll add that one of those populations is student housing, provided that at least a certain percentage of the students are lower income. The amount of the state density bonuses depends on the number of affordable units and how deep the affordability subsidy is. And the bonuses are requested by developers. The developers can also ask for concessions and waivers from zoning standards that they need to make their projects more viable. So I'm going to actually walk you through an example. Well, first, the state density bonus chart. You don't have to commit this to memory. It's essentially copied straight off of the government code, which essentially says if you have a project that includes X percentage of affordable units in these categories, here's the bonus you are entitled to. So how it works, if you, let's say hypothetically, you're in a community that has a 15% inclusionary requirement, and that's 10% low and 5% very low. We just made that distribution up. It could be any other permutation of 15%. So you have a 5-acre site that's zoned at 20 units per acre. So you can build 100 units under the zoning. Under the inclusionary requirement, we're saying 15 must be affordable, 10 low and 5 very low, based on that brown box on the left. So if you look at the table in the previous slide, you find out that you get a 40% density bonus if you provide those units on site. So your 100 unit project may be now a 140 unit project, and all of the bonus units that you can add are market rate. They can be market rate units. So you don't continue to apply that percentage to your bonus units. The bonus units are all market rate. And then the developer can request additional height, reduced parking, and other waivers and concessions to make the project work. And there are limits on the number of concessions and waivers that you can request based on the affordability of your project. So hypothetically, again, if the community only had a 10% inclusionary requirement, and that was for low income housing, then your density bonus would be only 20%. So you're providing a smaller percentage of affordable units at a less, at a shallower level of subsidy because you're going for low income instead of very low income. Then you get 20 bonus units in that project, and 10 of those would be low income units. But you're still entitled to that additional height and other concessions in order to make the project, if you need those to make the project work. And again, you would be limited in the number of concessions and waivers that you're entitled to ask for. The only point, I think, as I mentioned, we're not making a specific recommendation here. We're just saying that it's really important as you think about the percentage of inclusionary units and the depth of affordability to be mindful of the potential impacts from the state density bonus program. And at that point, we have one more topic in the presentation, but maybe I will pause at that point to see if there are questions.
Any questions about inclusionary zoning or density bonuses? Carl, questions?
Yes, Madam Mayor, thank you.
You're welcome.
Ms. Hager, looking at subsidizing the developer, you talked about upzoning. I understand upzoning to be very much the same as pre-approved density bonuses. What would be the difference?
So if you are adopting an upzoning alongside an inclusionary housing ordinance, the developers would be entitled to that, whatever the new density or FAR limit is, and they would be required to provide the inclusionary units that are required under the inclusionary ordinance. If a density bonus, this is sort of opposed to having a density bonus that you can opt into and say, I want to provide affordable units in order to get these incentives and concessions, including the bonus. It would be, a mandatory requirement that you provide those affordable units, and also you're entitled to the density under or FAR that has been enabled by the upzoning. Does that answer the question?
It sort of does. Yeah, I guess I still see it as a pre-approved density permission, but yes, either way, I guess I understand that better. Thank you. If we were to merely rely on the state's density bonus to provide the developer's incentive package, what would be the downside of that? That is, the developer is going to get to build more units at market rate than we would otherwise allow because the developer chooses to put in some low income or ultra low income units. That's nothing we have any control over. Apparently it's pretty automatic. What would be the downside in allowing that course to take its path?
So if we're talking about using the density bonus to provide the incentives, I don't think that there necessarily is a downside. Some jurisdictions choose to adopt their own incentives because they think that those may be more effective than the density bonus incentives in incentivizing affordable housing or reducing the potential impacts. If you're talking about just using the density bonus instead of an inclusionary housing ordinance, I would say the major difference there would be that developers aren't required to build the affordable units. They have the choice to do the density bonus or not. And if they choose not to do the density bonus, they don't have to provide any affordable units in their project.
Yeah, if I may add to that, Commissioner Davis, it's a really excellent question, and it's a question that Afsha and I asked the developers when we were interviewing them, and their response really, I think, is that they're less inclined to propose to include inclusionary units and get the density bonus unless it's required of them. I think because there are other requirements in the zoning code that they have to deal with that make it more difficult for them to recoup the cost of building those additional units. I mean, I think that this is where they kind of come back around to the parking requirements and the height limits and other things and say, well, unless you tell us we have to build these units, we're not going to do it voluntarily, even if you give us more units on top, because we can't make it pencil out with the parking requirements as they are and so forth.
And I just want to add, I've worked on 2 projects with the state density bonus, one in Concord and one in Vallejo. And I think the bigger question is, what is the policy goal? And how do we achieve that policy goal? And in some cases, by using these tools, those policy goals become implementable.
Thank you, Director Almeida. I appreciate that. And Mr. Miller, I appreciate your explanation there too. I'm just trying to understand what the foundations of these different puzzle pieces look like. They seem in many ways similar, and they obviously have different outcomes. And I think that's what you just spoke to, Director Almeida. Thank you. That's all the question I have.
Thank you, Carl. Mike.
Yes, thank you. First, I just want to get a handle on scope. So you referenced 170 cities and counties in the staff report have adopted inclusionary policy. And I believe that total population is around 500. So does that sound right, that 1/3 have adopted inclusionary housing, but 2/3 have not? Is that a reasonable statement?
You're correct in your math. I mean, the numbers of cities in California is just over 500, and 170 is about 1/3. Yeah.
Okay, great. Got that. And this ordinance is being suggested for the entire town versus the 2 centers. Is that also correct?
That would be your decision, but typically when an inclusionary ordinance is developed, it's applied to the entire community.
Okay, but we could limit this to the 2 town centers.
You could, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, that Lafayette does that. Lafayette only has an inclusionary requirement in the downtown area and not townwide.
Yeah, currently they are looking to expand it as part of their housing element. And I do want to share that the town of Danville applies it townwide. So if you have a subdivision that's coming in, let's say it's 6 homes or 13 homes, then the inclusionary would kick in. And they managed to do it on a subdivision, and 2 of the units were duplex units. And so that's how they've met their inclusionary requirements.
And if I recall, our strategy, though, is to sort of focus our affordable housing on the 2 centers. So again, one could follow that strategy and put inclusionary into the 2 centers. So we have the option, right, Barry?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Next question. So many developers, and I've talked to a few myself, I can't make any money if you're going to force me to build inclusionary housing, and therefore nothing gets built. So the example is San Rafael, which was in the staff report, which is very good. They started at 20%, they dropped it to 10%. So what's your reaction to that? If we do 10% inclusionary housing, and it turns out that not only we don't get the inclusionary, but we don't get, let's say, moderate units, which, it's not low or very low, but it would be a benefit to us. You have a reaction to that?
I think that's really where the state density bonus incentives come in, and the fact that you can get those additional units and that additional height or reduced parking or the other waivers that come with the density bonus really are effective in offsetting the cost of setting aside particularly if it's a 10% requirement. You know, if you were to go with a 20% requirement, which is where San Rafael was before they lowered it, you'd be creating a greater hardship, and that would be a tougher gap to close.
Right. And you've showed some local cities with inclusionary housing. I think the town most like us, Orinda, my understanding is they are not going forward with inclusionary housing in their latest housing element. They're going to use the density bonus as the voluntary tool. So, again, interesting perspective. Anything to share on that? Why they've chosen that path versus what we're debating?
Yeah, I don't know, Afsha, when you spoke with Orinda, if they offered any insights into that.
The insight that they offered was that the density bonus now is just much more flexible. Whether it will stand with HCD, we have yet to see.
I'd just like to add that Orinda is in a slightly different situation as well, as they had a downtown specific plan that they were in the process of completing, and that plan met all their zoning required needs. So they're not going through this intensive, extensive process that the town of Moraga is, kind of really looking at all of our different codes and requirements to determine what can move forward, what they should bring forward, and what the future should look like, because they're just able to do that through the downtown plan. So it's just it's a little different project.
And then one additional thing I would like to add, when we're considering a policy which is more focused on certain areas, or whether we're considering townwide, ADUs also count towards our low and very low. So that's another thing to consider when we're doing townwide.
Okay, thank you. That's ADUs that are rented out, correct?
Yes.
Okay, all right. My last question. So, and this is a sort of an inequity question. It's about grandfathering an approved development, yet we could apply inclusionary housing. So I'm talking about the Moraga Center specific plan. So I think, as we said last time, we have a couple applications, but if we adopted inclusionary housing, that would apply to the remainder of the Moraga Center specific plan. That plan was approved in 2010, 12 years ago, went through a number of updates. I thought we had finalized that last year, and now we're putting a potential cost burden, at least from one perspective, known as the landowner, on that development. So do we have the option, if we wanted to, from a perspective of equity, I might say fairness, to grandfather a development like that?
Oh, I see the town attorney has logged in.
Uh-oh. Thank you, Ari.
Barry, if you had something you wanted to say, feel free to start, and then I'll.
Well, I was going to point out that we are increasing the allowed density from 20 to 24 units per acre. So we're already actually changing the MCSP zoning by creating more development opportunity on those properties. But we're also not talking about individual development applications. We're talking about a plan. And so I believe, and this is where the attorney can help me, the difference between being a plan being grandfathered versus a project being grandfathered, and there's a different standard that would apply to both of those.
Yes, and that's correct. If an application has come in that is complete or falls under certain legal standards, for example, a preliminary application that's come in under SB 330, then this town could not apply any new laws. So, for example, if an inclusionary ordinance is adopted, that would not apply to projects with existing applications. It would only apply to projects that come in with a new application. With respect to the MCSP area, as noted earlier, the town could adopt an inclusionary ordinance that applied to certain areas of the town, but there would need to be a reasonable basis for doing that. And imposing that in one area versus other areas.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Any other questions? Okay, Brenda.
Sorry, okay, thank you. Lots of info here. My question is piggybacking off of Commissioner Davis's question. This seems very circular in that, again, why would the density bonus not be enough? When you say it doesn't incentivize them to build low-income housing, I understand that, but then we're putting something forward potentially like inclusionary housing that when you have this parachute where you can just pay a fee and get out of it, it also does not incentivize building the housing. Being that California is mandating that you have to give them this out to the density or to the low-income housing, I wouldn't think that you can make your fee so cost prohibitive that they couldn't even pay the fee. So I guess is there a benefit to the town for the inclusionary where they get fees? I'm just not sort of seeing the difference because we're not meeting the goal of building, the low-income housing sort of either way. I'm not seeing a difference, I guess is what I'm saying.
So
that makes sense.
Yeah, with the density, a developer can opt into the program.
Right.
And so it's their choice whether they want to provide inclusionary housing or not.
Right.
If we go with an inclusionary housing requirement, we're actually mandating it at our local level to achieve certain goals that we have established.
But it's still their choice because they can pay a fee and get out of actually building the low-income housing.
Well, that's one of the nuances that we're discussing tonight, whether we want to go with an in lieu fee or not.
And Commissioner Lester, the fee, this is where how you set that fee becomes really critical, because if you set that fee at, $400,000 a unit, you're not going to see the same number of people paying it than if you set it at $40,000 a unit. And those numbers are real. They exist out there, and that is the sort of range we're talking about. So yes, it's a policy decision that you need to make. Where do you set the fee? And many communities say we really want those units on site. It's a really important goal. It's the way we're going to meet our RHNA, and we want to make it difficult to use the in lieu fee option.
Okay, so it sounds like there's more teeth in it than I'm sort of imagining. So that sounds good. Okay, thank you.
So in our discussions with developers, what we also heard was sometimes they don't want to invoke the density bonus because it has a more deeper depth of requirements. They would rather do inclusionary, and it's a more flexible mechanism for them. And it still allows the city to achieve our goals and allows them to get, let's say, a waiver on parking standards, for example. They're not always looking for more density.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. I have two. If you start with an inclusionary zoning ordinance at 15% and you realize that it is actually creating disincentives to development, can you roll it back, or is that basically considered downzoning?
It would not be considered downzoning if you rolled back the percentage from, that's essentially what San Rafael did a few months ago. They rolled it back from 20% to 10%.
Okay. And what is the best argument for a jurisdiction, especially one that is loath to set up a whole administrative process and devote resources to collecting money and accounting for it and then dispensing it as appropriate? What is the best argument for going that route on the in lieu fees?
I think you'd have to, it's really, that would be a developer question. Why would they pay a fee instead of, am I understanding the question right? What would be the rationale for someone to choose an in lieu fee? Or
no, from the municipality's perspective.
I think that from a municipality's perspective, they would typically want to see the unit produced
Yes.
and create whatever incentives it takes to make that happen. Having the fee would be really, to me, it may make the fees make more sense in the larger communities where they can accrue faster and be used to underwrite or leverage the 100% affordable developments. So you see larger cities with more affordable housing construction allowing the fees at a higher level.
I was going to say the same thing, Barry. The strongest argument I've seen for in lieu fees that cities like is it creates flexibility and they can leverage the funds at 3 or 4 times as much by attracting other federal funds. So there's sometimes some flexibility with leveraging funds for larger projects. But I think it assumes you have a pot of money that's big enough to do that with. I don't know if Stephanie has more experience in affordable housing financing, but I think it's sort of the flexibility of leveraging funds for bigger projects is like the classic in lieu, the argument for that from local jurisdictions I've heard.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. In some cases, you can end up getting more affordable units by collecting fees and allowing an affordable housing developer to leverage those fees to build a 100% affordable project than you would get by, letting inclusionary units come in through market rate projects. But that does require amassing a certain, quantity of in lieu fees to be able to do that. And for a town your size, that's maybe not the most realistic path forward.
And I heard something earlier, and I just want to be clear. Is it or is it not a state requirement that if you have an inclusionary zoning ordinance, you have to take in lieu fees at some level?
You have to allow for at least one alternative means of compliance. So it could be an in lieu fee. You could say developers are allowed to do a land dedication or some other, some jurisdictions list out various alternative means of compliance, but sort of leave it unwritten in the ordinance and say, if you want to do this, we have to get approval from the city council or something along those lines. So there's a lot of different ways to go with that. It doesn't have to be an in lieu fee. But that's most common.
I'm sorry, Stephanie. So you could do it on a project basis, project basis.
Yeah.
Okay.
There are various trade-offs we get into there, but I'll just give you the short answer, which is yes, you could.
but buyer beware. Okay, I got it. Thank you.
When we had Eden Housing and EBHO Housing at our panel, when we were doing affordable housing tools, one of the projects that they shared was a developer who had done 100% market rate units, and then at another site he was able to do affordable units. So there are land alternatives that developers can consider.
Okay. All right. Barry, is the next section going to be?
It's short.
And sweet?
Yes. We will make sure of that. Okay. Yes, our last topic is density transfers, and this is a short one, and then we have a couple of slides on next steps. So what the density transfer does is it allows the development potential of a property to be transferred to another site. And this is something that the town might consider doing as a way to protect open space or historic buildings or particular natural features. What it requires is that there is a sending site, which is where the density is coming from, and a receiving site, which is where the density is going to. And this is already something that's in the Moraga Municipal Code. The issue now is that it is limited in terms of which zones are the sending zones and the receiving zones. So right now, you can transfer density out of land that's designated as open space or residential, 1 unit per acre through 6 units per acre, and you can only transfer that density to land that is zoned residential. And these transfers, just to be clear, are initiated typically by the property owner, who in some cases may own both properties. So in this case, we're going straight to the staff recommendation, and this is to expand the list of sending areas so that it includes the new rural residential zone, which is being created on a parallel path to the housing element update, plus other parcels that are in very high fire hazard severity areas. And then to also expand the list of receiving areas, which are the zones to which development rights may be transferred, to include all commercial zones in the town. And the important distinction here is that we would allow the zones in which housing is not a permitted use currently to be included in that, which are the MCSP Ranch, MCSP CC Community Commercial, the Ranch Overlay, and then the limited commercial zoning district in the Ream Center area. So that would be, those would be potential receiving zones for any density that is transferred. So that leads me to the next steps. We're asking that the council and commission provide feedback on a set of policy questions that we've run through in this presentation and that I'll summarize on the next slide. We'll be taking your feedback and using it both for drafting housing element actions and programs and also to develop draft ordinance language and standards that reflect the direction provided. We're still working on a timeline to bring the draft housing element to you and then submit it to HCD as a working draft during summer and continue during the summer working on our draft environmental impact report. We will then be working on the zoning standards and general plan amendments and coming back to you toward the end of the year with the revised housing element that incorporates the state comments and the draft EIR zoning and general plan amendments for your consideration in public hearings, first at the Planning Commission and then at the Town Council. So this is essentially a wrap up of the topics we've discussed and where we've asked for feedback. A quick recap on parking, we're asking that you consider reduced requirements for apartments, especially students, studios, one bedrooms and guest parking, and allow for reductions where TDM programs are implemented. We're suggesting you continue to use density, that you use a 45-foot height limit for residential and mixed uses in the suburban commercial and in the new mixed commercial residential zone at the Ream Center. Adopt a 10 to 15% inclusionary zoning requirement, and then change the density transfer rules as I've just mentioned in the last couple of slides. And that concludes the presentation. I'm happy to bring that last slide with the discussion questions back up at any time if anyone would like to see that again as we get into the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Barry. Excellent presentation. Really appreciate it. I want to open it up before we go into feedback and input from the panelists. Open this up for public comment. I see we do have some members of the pub. Yes, Mike. You're on mute.
We're just past 2 hours. Can we have a 5-minute break?
Of course. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. So it's 8:05 now. We'll start public comment at 8:10. Thank you.
Thank you.
the agenda, and I ask that comments be limited to 3 minutes or less, and please use your raise hand feature if you'd like to comment. I see Ashley Coates. Ashley, come on in.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Welcome.
I generally agree with many of the staff recommendations, and I want to focus on the inclusionary zoning. I believe it is important to have a mandatory program. It should include single family and multifamily housing. But I don't want us to get so high a limit that it will be a freeze on. We don't want it to, I can't think of the word now. Anyway, I'm suggesting 10% affordable. So for instance, single family might be 10% affordable to moderate income, multifamily ownership might be 10% moderate or 5% low. Maybe multifamily rental would have to be 10% low or 5% very low. That's the only thing I wanted to weigh in on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Any other public comment? Oh, Dave Rizzoni. Dave, you're on mute, I think. There you go. Although we can't hear you. Dave, can you hear us? There, I think you're good now. No?
Okay, I don't know.
There you are. We can hear you, Dave. Welcome.
You can hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh my God, I didn't touch anything. All right. My 3 minutes is up, so thank you.
Great comments, Dave. You know,
Yeah,
your 3 minutes starts now.
Yeah, okay, I've got quite a few comments. First of all, with this density transfer, you know how I feel about our Bollinger Valley property. It's been treated differently than all the other properties. So, taking a minimized development potential lowered down to 35 units from, as compared to Sanders Ranch or whatever at 2 dwelling units per acre, paying us peanuts for property that you've sold, is really insulting. Inclusionary zoning, this is a big issue, and I think you force anybody to do anything, there are bad consequences to this. I don't have to go into a lot of detail. All you have to do is just look at the quick reference to San Rafael. They got it wrong, and they had to come back and adjust their plan. And frankly, going back to the November meeting that we had with, I think it was, both the council and the planning commission, the consultants at that time said, if you are contemplating enacting an inclusionary housing, we should have a proper study because you can get it wrong and you want to make sure you're getting it right. So you need a proper and thorough study. And as a matter of fact, I think they might have even talked about some studies that they did in Napa and some other communities. So some of the affordable housing consultants that you had at the time verified that concept. So it just seems to me, we're discussing inclusionary zoning like it's already approved and it's the way to go. I don't know any developers. Now, obviously, I haven't gone out and asked anybody, but I find it difficult to believe that they would prefer an inclusionary housing zoning, over state. I don't know if they prefer either or, but if everybody was knocking down the door saying, let's get the inclusionary housing, well, we'd have almost 70% of the communities that don't have inclusionary housing. They should be pounding on the door saying, hey, why don't we have it like the 30% of the communities that do? So I don't see the benefit to inclusionary housing. I know that Jerry Brown, when he was mayor of Oakland, and when he was governor, he was adamantly opposed to inclusionary housing. Now, somebody might say, well, that was X years ago. But like I said, staff report, made it clear that saying, okay, you can have negative impacts if the requirements are too high. And then on the other hand, they say you might have missed opportunities. So like I said, someone is acknowledging that if you're going to be getting this, you need additional study, which we don't have right now. And I think we're making a mistake by advancing this inclusionary housing and saying, yeah, let's do it. It's a big mistake. And I don't see anything that makes sense unless the town is really going to enact an inclusionary housing program that provides a lot of benefits, a lot of extra benefits that I have not seen yet to the developer that would encourage him. So it's almost like more carrot and no stick. So I haven't seen anything with respect to that. And frankly, if Orinda hasn't done it and a lot of the other communities haven't done it, I don't see a benefit for inclusionary housing. And I have not been convinced to change my opinion. So until and unless the town comes with huge benefits to say, hey, let's work with us and do that. Now, I just have to say, my past experience with the town trying to enact implementation to the Moraga Center specific plan, they implemented a lot of additional constraints that I was opposed to at the time. So
Dave, your time is up. I'm sorry. Can you wrap up?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. As part of the API, constraints analysis is important. And frankly, I think the town has enacted a bunch of very severe, strict development standards that acts as a method to preclude development. And in terms of the concessions and waivers that you get from the state benefits, most people go and say, hey, Moraga or some communities have very strict standards that we can't abide by. So I think Moraga in its 2020 implementation, Moraga Center implementation, they enacted a lot of rules that were contrary to SB 330.
Dave, you're way over time.
Thank you. Do you get a visual of me when I'm talking, or is it just?
No, we just see your name.
Oh, well, you're missing part of the show.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you for your comments. Okay, Jeffrey Stone.
Is that now? So I could take 25 minutes on this as well. I'm a community member and a developer locally. What does a developer do when he analyzes or when she analyzes whether to develop? They assess risk, reward, restraints, and recourse. The risk and reward is up to us developers to understand within our underwriting. The restraints is something that you guys are discussing tonight. The recourse is what we have to sign our life away to gamble bankruptcy and then take 10 years of liability in the consumer protection state. I'm going to focus on parking and the inclusionary code, even though I could take 20 minutes as well. Parking should be reduced for condos and apartments. I only see that you guys specified for apartments. Condominium projects should be associated the same. The world is changing. Plan for the future, not for today. 1 bedroom should only require 1 vehicle. 2 beds at the very most should require 2. 3 bedrooms at the very most should require 2 stalls. By reducing parking, you free up site and height for density, which has value to developers. Parking in Moraga is very expensive to build, and we get no value by building it, which means that you're forcing us into building a net yield that affects our underwriting. You're thus also reducing where we can put density. You're thus reducing our overall revenue, which goes to our reward. Affordability. California housing shortage, and I want to echo Dave Brazzoni's opinion here. You must understand underwriting from a level of affordability, which is a mathematical exercise. We are looking at anecdote tonight. I've not heard anything about AMI. I've not heard anything about VLI. I've not heard anything about LI. I have not heard anything about moderate and how it actually affects developers in their underwriting. And we're using anecdote from other cities and other locations, not reasonably understanding the area median income for which we actually have to take that risk, for which we're here in the first place to actually build regional housing needs allocation requirements. The way to build out the state of California, in my opinion, is by building market rate development. We would have never been here in the first place. We have 4 million units that we're short in the state of California because we continue through CEQA, political exercises, and other means to prevent developers from wanting to take the risk for the reward so that we stay in the same place. I'll summarize so that I don't take too long as well. Parking is one of the biggest issues that I see within Moraga on the multiple sites that I'm assessing of whether or not to take the risk reward. The changing interest rate market, the 10-year treasury inverting, the need for additional equity in a debt market that's going to continue to put constraints on our ability to develop is going to put us in a place that we're going to be back here in 10 years from now, figuring out if we're going to 65 to 75 feet. So my strong recommendation is to truly understand inclusionary code, truly understand parking, truly understand height and site limitations when it comes to density before you enact something that we might have to change in the near future that affects our lovability of living here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. All right, any other public comment? I see none, Marty. I see none. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay. Gonna close public comment. All right, and now it's time to bring it back to the commissioners and council members. So we have the sort of the five topics that staff and Barry are looking for input and feedback on. And what I would propose to do is to go around the horn and ask each commissioner and each council member to provide input on whichever topics they want to provide input on. So either all five or two or one, or just, this is our opportunity to kind of provide our thoughts so that when this all comes back to us with a wrapped up and with a bow, that there are no surprises and that our sort of policy level thinking is reflected. So let's try it that way. And so which member of the Planning Commission would like to kick us off? Brenda, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I will go through briefly. Don't let my brevity fool you into thinking that I'm not seriously considering all of these things, but we have a lot of people who want to say things here. So the first one on parking, I just want to make a small note that scarcity sort of results in conflict. So let's just keep that in mind. However, I do agree with staff's recommendation moving forward to reduce for, I would say, condo and apartments, if that has to be specified. And I'm also interested in looking at the possibility of the TDM programs, if we are able in the future to review that on a case-by-case basis. I don't think I want there to be a blanket TDM set of options that staff gets to decide on necessarily. But again, we can discuss that. Maybe that would help with quicker development. The second one for density versus FAR, I also agree with staff recommendations to stick with density at this point. Building heights, if we have discussed and mulled over those things in the Moraga Center specific plan, I see no reason at this point, but again, we can discuss why we wouldn't want to increase that height to 45 as well at the Ream Center. And I do like the idea as well of making sure that we can have it set back from the road that Councilmember Walke mentioned. In terms of the inclusionary issue, in free markets, I'm not a fan of mandates, but for the sake of problem solving, I would be willing to take another look at the potential for the 10%, the lowest option of the inclusionary requirement, and discuss what details can go with that. And then the fifth one was I think that was something that was the law that we sort of just have to move forward with, the encouraging density bonuses. And the density transfer, I'm interested in seeing what those transfers would look like. Those possibilities, that we need a little bit more specifics on that. I think that.
Thank you, Brenda.
Thanks.
Appreciate the brevity. We know that there's a lot of thought that went behind it. Nick.
Thank you, Mayor. So I will caveat my statements with the fact that 5 years ago, last month, I moved to Moraga. We looked for about a year in the Loma Linda area. Our realtor drove us through Moraga, we saw the 2 shopping centers and we said, turn around, how quickly can we get out of this community, to be quite honest. So fast forward 5 years and here I am on the planning commission. My wife is on the PTA. We are fully committed to the community. We love it. I want to see it as see it thrive. And so knowing though that it's not Walnut Creek, I do want to focus, or I do want to see the 2 shopping centers. I want to see them thrive, and I don't want to, for lack of a better term, half-ass the housing that gets put there, and make it so that they're not a destination, certainly in Moraga, and hopefully for the larger area, including Orinda, Lafayette, and potentially folks outside of that. And so with that in mind, I am in favor of lowering parking standards. I do think, touching on Commissioner Davis's comment around college students, if we can work with St. Mary's on shuttle services, I know that there are ride sharing and car rental options galore that are not going away. I would love to see increased bikeability. My family and I have ridden from our house to the farmers market, to the Moraga Commons, along the trail, and frankly, some of the parts of that stretch, getting from where we live in the Campo neighborhood, are a little bit hairy, as evidenced by the individual that unfortunately passed away, having been hit. So I think we really should work on bikeability, work on pedestrian thoroughfares to increase, frankly, the livability of our community. The next 2, density and building height. I am all in favor of incentivizing development. My earlier comment around the 2 centers in town. So I do want to see flexibility. I think FAR actually allowing developers to decide what to do will promote development. I think, as to my earlier question, I think we should really look into increasing building heights in the Ream Center. I don't think it will have an impact on our semi-rural feel. I think incentivizing density and additional units will enable developers to really build showcase housing with retail below that will really create this town. I mean, we've been talking about a town square on the planning commission with the ball field, and I think we need to incentivize developers to really maximize their profit, which would then encourage them to create areas, enable them and encourage them to create areas for the rest of the town to benefit from, not just the folks that are living above. As far as inclusionary zoning, I like the concept. I think community-wide, it benefits all of us. It benefits all of our children. I think it's a very good concept. I do not want it to get in the way of encouraging development. So I think it does need to be done in a very thoughtful manner. And then related to density bonus, I spoke with a developer friend of mine, and Barry or Mr. Miller and the other consultants may be able to correct me, but my understanding is that the density bonus came in to basically slap the wrist of the municipalities that were creating inclusionary zoning that was onerous, and developers said, fine, if you're going to require this, I'm just going to go and use the density bonus. And so I don't think it's a good idea to rely on density bonus for developers to come in. Like we've heard from the developers on this call, they are looking at profit margins. Building that housing doesn't necessarily increase their bottom line. And so I do think we need to incentivize it, but I also think we need to provide additional incentives for the folks who are going to build it. And then lastly, for the density transfer, I like it in concept. I frankly don't understand it totally, and so I would like to hear more about it. But if it encourages development in the town of Moraga, then I'm all for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Carl.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I care about the parking. I was raised in Berkeley before ADUs, and when most of America, by 2/3 margin, most of America had only one car or none. We could all play on the streets at that time, much like we can on the streets in Moraga still today. With the uptick in ADUs and in-law units and split lots, I have to assume that our parking is going to get less and less generous, whether we change the rules or not. I encourage us not to change the parking rules. They have been reasonable and moderate standard for 50 years. They're not particularly out of line with our neighbors, nor are they out of line with the number of cars in America, in California, or in our region. There are more cars per unit in the San Francisco Bay Area and the LA Bay Area than anywhere else in this country other than South Florida. Cutting our parking is cutting our own throats, particularly when we're considering cutting the parking next to the shops that are underneath all the new housing. Truly, truly backwards. It'd be hard for people to continue to say, yeah, I shop in Moraga because there's parking. Other than parking, I don't feel strongly about any of the issues brought up tonight. I see good work. I see a promise to do more work, and I see some good ideas. And I applaud all of those, and I don't have a problem with anything else that was presented. I do feel strongly about the parking. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. Graham?
Hi, thank you. So briefly on parking, sorry, Commissioner Davis. I would be in favor in parking reductions. Would be curious to see what we can come back with some proposed transportation demand measures that show appropriate reductions based upon housing type and location. As far as floor area ratio or FAR versus density, caveat, I do work for a commercial real estate developer based in San Francisco, so I do see the benefits of floor area ratio. I think we're seeing a trend in smaller, more affordable units, and I think this would be more attractive to encourage what would be that coming into play in the downtown areas of Moraga. Similarly with height limits, I think we should be open to, I think there was a mention of setbacks as well too, open to height limits that would also support ground floor commercial heights that we're seeing in modern tenants for the commercial ground floor spaces with greater allowable floor heights to support that ground floor floor to ceiling. Around both inclusionary housing and density bonuses. I think these are two ways to both provide a path to a more diverse Moraga, again, kind of finding that similar alignment with lower income and more affordable opportunities in the community. However, with density transfer, would rather see us strive towards integrating, as far as density transfers, would rather see that on site. So we had more inclusionary housing as part of a site-specific development as opposed to move that off to other sites, just given the limited locations we have for development in the town. Just to be brief, I think that's all I got for now.
Thank you, Graham. Marcus?
Yes, thank you. Okay, I too will keep it brief. So a couple notes. I'm just going to start with a high level one. So I really enjoyed reading the feedback as well from the developer interviews, and to be frank, we've been at this meeting now for 2.5 hours, and we heard from potential developers in this town, the folks that are actually going to be responsible for building housing, for refurbishing the shopping centers. We heard from them maybe 10 minutes. We need to hear a lot more from the developers, and we need to understand the factors and the levers that they're looking at as well. That's just very high level, but I think for us to spend this much time on this and to only have a little bit of time allocated to hearing from the developers through public comment is really doing us a disservice. So that being said, parking. I like table 1 laid out very well. I would be comfortable moving ahead with what Orinda and Danville have. If anything, aligning the guest parking more in line with what those two municipalities have. The other ones, I'm in line with I take it back. Inclusionary housing. We can't afford to be San Rafael. We can't afford to make a mistake and then go backwards. I would much rather, if we went with inclusionary housing, be at 3 to 5%, see how that worked. And then if we can bump it up to 8% to 10%, I'd much rather do that than to be at, at like 50% or 18% and then realize that, oh, geez, that's not working. And now we're not encouraging the development that we're looking for and having to move backwards. So I would like us to think about that. Building height, okay with the building height that's recommended. And then the density also okay with that recommendation. And like a few other commissioners, I don't know enough about the last topic, the transfer, to have a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Carrie.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you for staff for all of the information you put together for us. It's really appreciated, and thank you to Director Hamid for really helping to answer a lot of my questions that I had earlier today. And I'm going to try to be sure that I sound coherent here, and also don't take too much time, given that I'm somewhat sleep deprived with the newborn. But what I would want to talk about first is just taking a step back from this for a second. And I think that Commissioner Polsky kind of hit on this in his comment on when he and his wife were originally looking for which community in La Miranda that they would settle in. I don't know that I had the same extent of a reaction as Commissioner Polsky, but I can definitely say that, when you arrive in Lafayette, you've arrived in Lafayette. And part of that is due to the placemaking that has occurred along the corridor. When you arrive in Orinda, especially when you've arrived near the theater, you've arrived in Orinda. When you get to Moraga, there are two strip malls that are old and somewhat or significantly in need of updating. There are really three places in Moraga that really make a statement on what this community is. One is St. Mary's, which I think most people will agree is gorgeous. Another is the Moraga Center, and then another is Ream Center. Fortunately, Ream Center has the theater, which adds some character, but we need more place setting to identify what this community is. And I think that we have this opportunity, and also provided, given that the state and our region has really put an onerous burden on us of identifying where we can place over 1,000 units, which it has the potential to dramatically change what this community is. And so what we're talking about are really the rules of the road for how we as a community want to dramatically change ourselves based on how these zoning and other rule changes are really implemented. I also really appreciated hearing from two local developers, especially Dave Brazzoni, who, he is the central landowner in one of those places. And I do think that as we move forward in figuring out how to actually get development put in place, the landowners play a key role as partners with the town in figuring out really how we implement the vision of trying to make these two centers a place that really identifies what Moraga is, a place that also helps to increase the diversity and make Moraga a more inclusive community. So to that point, because we're talking about things that are so dramatic, I think that for some of these things where we can be incremental, my opinion is we should try to. For the parking standards, I definitely am support of the staff recommendation. I think we heard from the developers that one of the most onerous pieces is with regards to parking. We are going to have to hear from staff when the report back comes on what types of mitigation are available to try to hit at some of the concerns that we've heard from some of my commissioners tonight and some of the council members. So I'm really keen on hearing how, if we are reducing parking, you know, there's 17,000 of us that are currently here. How am I going to still find a parking place in the movie theater, especially if that movie theater is able to expand as they do plan. In addition, where we can be incremental, I like the ideas that I've heard where we stick with what we got regarding density, but if it becomes appropriate in a specific developmental proposal to move to FAR, if that is something, I think and part of the reason is given how many changes we're making and how concerned this community is, as evidenced by the fact that we have one of the highest engagements of any community on the online tool for people really trying to figure out how to make this work. People need to know when we're approving something, it's more helpful to have a number than, I don't know, we'll see what the developer says. Which I'm not saying that's necessarily where FAR is, but it's a lot harder to explain than something a concept that folks are more used to, which is how many units are you actually talking about? With density, we can actually answer that question. To height limits, I would say that Ream Center makes even more sense than it did at Moraga Center to go to 45 feet, given the hillside that's adjacent. Going even higher than that at Moraga Center is, I find, with the possibility of that concerning, but given state density bonuses, as Councilmember McClure pointed out, that's entirely in the realm of possibility. That said, it also would be somewhat unfair to the landowner at Ream Center if not provided some of the same opportunities provided to the landowner at the Moraga Center. In terms of inclusionary housing, I'm supportive. That said, I'm supportive of an incremental approach. I haven't heard this from my commissioners. I did hear this from, I believe, at least one council member. Given what our goal is and what our focus is, you don't want to take your eye off the football. And again, going with incrementalism here, I'm supportive of implementing inclusionary housing at the two centers, and at the two centers at the 10%, to not go too high. We could potentially increase that percentage. We could also, if it's successful, we could also potentially increase the applicability to other places in town. But again, we want to try to incentivize development. We want to try to incentivize affordable development, specifically in these places. So I'm really interested to hear, as we heard some of the developers, if we do pursue that end, what the incentives are, what the carrots are that really help to somewhat compensate for the stick that we're proposing. In addition, of course, I would be supportive of the encouragement of density bonuses and density transfers. I definitely think the staff recommendation, like many of you have heard my concerns on development at the wildland-urban interface and with in high fire danger areas. And I think that this would provide the town another tool in order to also help developers so that they can find a way to be able to realize the potential of their land, while also finding the development potential in places the community finds palatable. So those are really my thoughts. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. All right, council members. Going once, going twice. Vice Mayor.
The rest of you are so chicken. Okay, first of all, I compliment the staff report. It really is excellent and especially getting input from developers. This is a very complex subject, so I don't think we're going to answer all questions tonight. I really want to summarize and say, I think this is turning into a wonderful opportunity for Moraga. We have long suffered from excessive commercial property, supplemental property, and as has been already noted by a couple of the commissioners, that creates a certain detriment to the town, the visual of the town. So we need to use this as an opportunity to address that. On the specific 5 or 6 items here, when we talk about parking, I think my overall comment is we need to look. I advocate looking at this both at a macro and a micro level. Macro at a shopping center, mixed commercial residential basis, recognizing that you're going to have assigned parking and maybe then some common shared parking, and that guest parking may be part of that, and then opportunistic on-street parking. That's always been there, opportunistic on-street parking. Noting, contrary to what we heard earlier, the town does have an ordinance with regard to how long you can park at a particular location on street parking. But if we go with the town recommendations, I'm okay with that. But I really am interested in likewise giving developers the opportunity to reduce the number of parking places, taking into account the TDM's transportation demand management opportunities, and I'd like to hear more about that before we exclude that. With regard to density and FAR, honestly, I view this as a non-decision, because I think what I heard tonight is that in the MCSP, it already is being applied in the mixed use commercial residential areas. I think, Barry, that's what you told me, and so let's apply it, because otherwise applying density to the commercials, I didn't hear another answer for that. With regard to building height, I think I agree with most everyone else that a 45 foot at Ream appears to be practical and also consistent with MCSP. I would advocate for making it stepped or setback, and perhaps restricting the height to 35 feet near Moraga Road and Ream at the Ream Shopping Center area, and even perhaps, depending upon how close it is to Moraga Road or Ream, even stepping it before you go all the way up to 35 feet. If you look at 5A rental, it sits back quite a ways, and the units that are close to Moraga Road are certainly not near 35 foot height. That moves us on to inclusionary zoning ordinance. You know, I'm coming to the conclusion. To me, it's how are we going to achieve that 1,118 units, and especially the 501 that are in those 3 categories of very low income, and moderate. It may be a requirement. You know, maybe the only way we can achieve it, and if that's the case, if we can achieve it with 10%, that certainly sounds like that's more practical than going with the 20% per center fell or 15% at the higher end there. And then let's do get to the incentives and see how much we can mitigate that for the developers. Oh, I guess I went out of order here. I don't think there's any input that's required with regard to density bonuses. And on density transfer, I think I look at that as an option to give to owners, developers of land, and let's try to make it attractive to those developers, owners, to the degree we can. And then finally, I recognize, and I hope we all recognize, that tonight we're at this level, and at some point we're going to get, at a much lower level, and we'll flesh some of that information out. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Teresa.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. First of all, in fact, Steve, I think we're thinking along the same lines. And I also want to start thanking staff and Barry's team for this report, because I felt that, what I read was they were asking developers, they were asking other towns, and quite a bit, more so than normal. And so I want to compliment you on that. I truly appreciated that. And I also appreciated Jeffrey Stone and Dave Berzoni chiming in and telling us, what they thought about this. And I hope that what we come up with, everybody will be somewhat happy with. I think that's a good goal. Also, we have a goal here that we have to come up with so much affordable and, low affordable, so on and so forth. That's our job. So how we do that, I hope everybody's somewhat happy with. So far as parking, and I'm also thinking condo and apartments and so on and so forth. I think what staff came up with is just fine. I am kind of concerned about the guest parking, because at MCC, I've seen how that's used and abused. And I think it would be important to talk to them and see what they've experienced and what's worked for them. So far as density and FAR, I agree with staff. However, I think that there's an opportunity, especially in the Ream Shopping Center, where FAR might work. So I wouldn't want to rule it out, because I think that's a possibility. Height, I agree that Ream should have 45, and I completely agree with what Steve had to say about the setbacks. And on a scenic corridor, the setback is 40 feet, and we have that now. And I want to make sure that we continue to have that, and that we also have step back. And I thought Steve's idea of the area that's closest to the street would be, 2-story. In fact, I believe that for the Moraga Shopping Center as well. I think that gives us the semi-rural idea more so than an urban idea. So we start off with a 2-story, and then we can step back or have a setback, maybe then a 3-story, and then whatever we have to have. I think that's really important. So far as inclusionary, I think that's the only way, saying that we have to have at least 10%, I think is the only way we're going to get what we want. And if that's not the right number, then I think we have to figure out what the right number is. But I think that's a good starting point. So far as density bonus, I think that's just a carrot that we're going to have to work with. But I don't want to give away the store with that. Density transfer, I think when we think about our wildlife interface and our high fire severity zone, this gives the landowners an opportunity that they wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that when the state comes out with their map, I think it's going to be to the benefit of the landowners to have a density transfer. So kind of in conclusion, one thing I want to bring up too is we got a letter, and maybe everybody has seen it and maybe they haven't, from the school district applauding what we're doing. And, because most of us moved here because of the schools, and then we fell in love with Moraga and the hills and the trails and everything. I think that the school district's buy-in is really, really important, because they're going to have to figure out where all these wonderful children are going to have to be. And evidently
they've got a plan, or at least they're open to a plan. So cheers for all of us. And one other thing I wanted to bring up too is St. Mary's College has a bus that goes from the BART up to the college and down. And I think that's something that we all need to be aware of. And hopefully we can work very collaboratively with St. Mary's College to see how this bus can work, because we really do not have this mass transit network that, you know, that they talk about. So maybe we have something that could help, that could work for us. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thanks, Teresa. Mike?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, first of all, to staff and Barry, your folks you do just fabulous. Thank you to the public comment, especially the two developers that called in. First, you know, I want to mention, if we look at the last 8-year housing element, we didn't come close on very low and low housing units. So going forward here, we're trying to make a number of changes. I'll comment on those in a minute. However, we need to do this with the stakeholders. And as I said last meeting, they need to have either a seat at the table or more time to talk. I would like to have them more actively involved in these meetings. So as Marcus said, I agree with that. And I'd like to see that going forward. I think they should have a chance to ask their questions. I talked to a developer today, and, you know, with the 3 business days from when the staff report came out, he had more questions than anything. So that's not good for a stakeholder. So if we're going to do this, we do it together. And as the other developer said too, hey, just to look at what other towns do, and most of those towns are not who we are. We are not Danville. We incorporated not to be Danville. We are not Walnut Creek. We are not Concord. We are not San Ramon. And it's interesting that town closest to us, Orinda, is, you know, they're taking some other provisions. So I would like to see us at a future meeting when we get some more information to give them a bigger role. In terms of comments on what we have in front of us, I'd like to see more information on parking from the macro view, residential, retail, commercial, office, and the 17,000 people that are going to drive there. I'm open to staff's recommendations in terms of reducing the parking standards, but I would like to look at the macro picture as well. Density versus FAR, I have a very strong opinion for density. FAR creates incredible uncertainty, and you could have over 100 housing units on 1 acre with FAR. That gives me, that does not agree with our semi-rural nature. So that's my opinion on that item. Ream, I am a consistency person, so if the Moraga Center gets 45 feet, I guess we have to have 45 feet here. The density bonus gets triggered, now it's 55 feet. So that's why I believe the step back idea that I mentioned is important, which is in the Moraga Center as well, consistency. And Steve's idea for setbacks 40 feet, or if possible, even more, so we don't have that potential 55-foot building too close to us. Inclusionary housing, that's a hard one. So we have 2 choices, either a voluntary density bonus where the developer gives us an application with inclusionary housing and gets the carrot of additional units at market. That's what Orinda's going to follow. Then we have the case where we're going to force you to build affordable units. I just don't really believe in that philosophy. I know if you don't do that, well, Mike, we may never get our goal. But on the other hand, well, what if a builder doesn't build it? You can't force a builder to lose money. So if a builder says, hey, I penciled this out, I can't make money. So not only I'm not going to build the affordable units, I'm not going to build any units. And what does that do to our housing crisis? So this is pretty complex at the end of the day. And I'd like to see more analysis and information on inclusionary. And this is where I definitely would like to have the property owners greater involved in how this can work and work for everybody. Because to me, the way this works is we find something that works for everybody. Not that we're going to force you to do that. I just don't think that's going to work. It might work for some people who figured it out, but for others, I don't think it's going to do it. And I do, as I did say, I believe our strategy is to concentrate affordable housing at the 2 centers. And if we do inclusionary housing, it should be at the 2 centers. I would keep it to that. ADUs are, state law. You have the right to do ADUs if they want to. Again, that would be their option. The inclusionary, I would keep at the 2 centers. And in lieu of fees, I want nothing to do with in lieu of fees. We have to hire our own department to handle that. And all of a sudden we're in development and not interested in going there. And in terms of density transfers, yes, at the owner's option, density transfers gives them the option and the tool. And I support that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Sona.
Thank you. So, complimenting staff, as everybody already said, the way that the information was presented was very conducive to decision making and streamlined decision making. Things like the pros and cons lists and the charts were extremely helpful. So when it comes to parking, I'm in alignment with staff's recommendations. I do hear a lot of chatter about parking in my townhome community. Lots of people say that they would even get rid of one of their cars if they had more places to walk to and more exciting retail and options. So to me, these reductions make sense, and the developer's input was very strong in this realm. Height, absolutely in support of everything that was already said here in terms of 45, but being mindful about setbacks. I think that that's an important part of preserving the character. Density transfers, I don't have anything different to add than others have said beyond just my general support for that. And when it comes to density versus FAR, I think it may be a little bit conservative to just continue going down the path of density, but with the uncertainty that it creates, we don't want to get into too much experimental here when we need to meet our numbers. So I understand why staff netted out the way they did. I just am still a little bit kind of hopeful and curious about what benefits FAR could really bring. And then lastly, I really do think that inclusionary housing, when thoughtfully designed, as others have said, is a very useful tool for actually creating the impact that we want, the impact that we want our policy to have in our town. There does need to be some flexibility for developers. So I think that the analysis that we see in terms of the drafts of this ordinance or the proposed kind of skeleton of this ordinance, it would be very valuable to hear from developers prior to us adopting something. My inclination is to do this town-wide, but without kind of weighing the pros and cons of limiting it to the specific areas. I'm concerned that we give the signal to the state that we're just trying to concentrate in certain areas, which is exactly the opposite of what RENA and the state have made clear. Of course, our strategy is to find opportunities in those centers, but that doesn't mean that the long-term kind of signal should be that we only want to build affordable housing, in concentrated areas. But I think that looking at a potential option for that in terms of comparing and contrasting the benefits of doing it, limiting it to these areas versus town-wide, to me, something like that would be very helpful to then make a decision on what this ordinance would look like. 10% seems like the way to go, as to not end up having to scaling it back later. And we should be looking at lessons learned from other jurisdictions. They don't want to end up in a situation where we have to completely scale back. Those are my comments. Thank you for all the very helpful discussion.
Thank you, Sona. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. I guess I get to be the cleanup hitter. So I want to echo my thanks, everyone else's thanks for the staff presentation. I also want to thank staff and the consultants for what was invisible tonight, which is the many hours that staff has spent with developers, with property owners, some of whom have hired architects to really talk about the impact that all of these ideas would have on them. So that I don't think was in their modesty. I don't think Afsha and Barry trumpeted that enough, but there was a hell of a lot of engagement with the stakeholders already, and as I understand it, it will continue to be the case. So it's not just limited to the public comments at our hearings, but it is an ongoing dialogue that had started months ago and that I expect will continue. So thank you for that. I also want to thank the members of the public who participated with great vigor and commitment in the Balancing Act, in filling out the survey, and that we had over 100 St. Mary's students fill out a survey. That's fantastic. I think that's input from the public like we've never seen before. For me, the overarching goal here is to make sure that things are built that are more accessible to a greater range of people in Moraga. And for me, kind of the guiding principles are clarity, consistency, and predictability, because I think those behoove both developers and the town. So specifically on the parking standards, I concur with the staff recommendation. I think we adopt the MCSP standards for consistency, clarity, and predictability. But I would like to see some flexibility around the edges that is responsive to proposals that include alternatives to car trips, and whether it's bike parking, whether it's shared parking, whether it's shuttles or whatever, that there be some horse trading on the parking if a development is bringing forward a proposal to get people out of their cars and into something else. Density versus FAR, called me a conservative stick in the mud, but I am more inclined towards sticking with density. I think Carrie said incremental approach. I think Mike mentioned that it's predictable and it's understandable. And I agree with that. So as a going in position, given the swirl of other stuff that's going on, given the overlay of density bonuses, I think that having a little bit of certainty and predictability on how many units are you actually talking about would be helpful, at least at the outset. And if we're finding that it's too limiting and it's not allowing for creativity, then we can overlay some FAR stuff down the road. Building height, yeah, let's go with the MCSP standard for mixed use development. On inclusionary housing, I'm struggling with this, but I think I am persuaded that we do an ordinance that has inclusionary zoning. I would start at the low end at 10% and see if we need more. I am also, at least at the moment, favoring starting with the commercial centers, the places where we are trying to drive development in the first instance, right? Because we've been very consistent that this is all about focusing on the commercial areas that are right now underutilized and are not what we would like them to be. So I am open to doing it townwide, but I think I would have to be persuaded that is necessary to effectuate what we're trying to do here. I too am not a fan of in lieu fees for two reasons. One is I don't want to have to set up, we don't have the resources nor the scale where that might make sense. But then separately, I just would prefer to create, there needs to be an alternative, a plan B for the developer to have it be something else if we have to do that. And then on density transfers, yes, I am in favor of providing that. I like the idea of giving opportunities to property owners to move density out of the far reaches of town, out of the high fire severity zones, out of the rural areas, because again, that's consistent with the general plan and our vision of moving the development into the commercial areas. So those are my thoughts, and I want to ask Barry and Cynthia and Afsha. I heard a lot of consistency and actually some consensus in a lot of areas. Do you feel like you've gotten sufficient input from us? I'll take it as a yes.
We're all waiting to see who goes first.
Yeah, I'm just gonna do a quick summary here. I know that there were some differences. In general, I think that there is consistency, but there's also a request for refinement in some areas. So overall, I think I heard for parking that there was consistency in a direction towards the staff recommendation, but some council members and commissioners wanted to see what TDM would look like and how it would work. With the height, most felt that the 45 would work, but they wanted to see setbacks and stepbacks. So I felt that that was a direction. With inclusionary housing, most felt that the 10% would work. And I think I'm still trying to weigh whether most felt that it was townwide or whether it should be focused on Ream and Moraga. So that's, I think, something that still needs further refinement and discussion.
I think, Afsha, if I may, I mean, what I heard is there's a split, but that there is an openness to hearing the case for one or the other. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of nodding.
If I could, maybe the case for doing it townwide, I think would be all of the multifamily housing opportunities are in the two areas. So what will happen outside of those areas is you will get either moderate income ownership opportunities or you'll get accessory dwelling units that are going to be deed restricted as affordable. You're not going to get multifamily housing in those outlying areas because it's not zoned, the zoning wouldn't support that. So if the concern about inclusionary in those outlying areas is that it will somehow induce multifamily housing, I don't believe that that's a concern that you would need to worry about. You know, the developers of those, and the other issue is there is very limited opportunity to develop beyond what's already been either approved or subdivided. So that would be the case for townwide. And I thought that actually Councilmember Mocker's comment about the affirmatively furthering fair housing was important, that we would, I think, need to make the case to the state that we're not concentrating our affordable housing opportunities in two locations only by limiting the inclusionary only to those two areas. I think we can make the case that you know what we're doing is not going to concentrate poverty per se, but we will have to actually explain that in our housing element.
Thank you. Steve, you had a comment?
Yes, could I ask the question again, please, in MCSP, where we have both the combined commercial residential and we use density, do we also use FAR or how do you handle the commercial density in that area?
Yeah, so you have a FAR for all of the commercial square footage, and then on top of that, you have a density standard for the residential development. So
did everyone hear that? I think that's what I think that's, if we're looking for consistency, is that what we want them to do for how we're moving forward? Did everyone hear that? So
Yes, we did, we heard it, Steve.
Okay, they're using both FAR and density down at MCSP.
That's what I asked about way back at the beginning.
Yeah, so,
We're gonna end up with
yes,
a blended
and
model.
so, I mean, is there, Afsha, is there a lack of clarity on that score? I mean, on the density versus FAR point? Do you
If you
need
wanna
more
be-
guidance, do you need
Nope.
more input on that?
Okay, fine, good.
Okay, so just, Mike, do you wanna, amend your comments on the inclusionary zoning, based on what Barry just said, or are you still, commercial centers only?
Yeah, I just think it follows our strategy. I am concerned that the state will look at us and think we are concentrating. I get that, but I think you can make the case. Our strategy is to have affordable there, and therefore inclusionary will follow our strategy. I mean, if I were reading it, that would be very logical. The reality is we don't have much left, right, to develop outside the two centers. So, and we're talking about ADUs, deed restricted. And to me, that's another issue. Talking to staff, they said, well, if they build it, then they're going to have to show us their lease that it's being rented out at a low income level, rent level, and in order to count. So we're going to go knock on somebody's door and say, okay, will you please show me your lease agreement, and we'll see if this counts or not. That just seemed to add a complexity when, you know, we can do, builders can do ADUs anyway, and I think builders are much more open to ADUs. So I'm trying to think what we're trying to solve for, and I think 90+% is the two centers. So, you know, I hear Barry's point of view, but it seems more logical to me.
Yeah, and I guess if I just may, I mean, I hear the arguments about the equity point. I think it's very important. I don't want to invite scrutiny where we don't need to. And if the reality is that as a practical matter, doing it townwide is there are other constraints that are going to prevent things springing up in the residential areas that one doesn't envision there or want there, then I am open to it being townwide.
Okay. I mean, I can go that way as well. It just seemed a logical pattern. But, you know, if that's the consensus, you know, I'll be glad to go along.
I also want to point out that we're a high resource area. HCD has basically said we're a high resource area, so we do need to really be very careful and thoughtful about these approaches.
Yes. And Teresa.
Thank you. You know, one thing that I have seen and that I have been part of being on council as many years as I have is we've always tried to get the density in the two shopping centers. So I don't think it's time to take a left turn on that in any way, shape, or form. So my opinion of the general plan and of past council members, and I hope future council members, is to direct the density in the two shopping centers.
Thank you. Carrie?
Yeah, I think that, Madam Mayor, the way that you summed it up is similar to my own feeling, which is, you know, Councilmember Mocker's comment on wanting to avoid an appearance that we're trying to basically just centralize where folks are going to be required to live is an apt one, but I think it's also one that can be provided with explanation. The part that I would be open to the idea of town-wide. I would just want to know a little bit more about what the potential unintended consequences are. Specifically, you know, additional units at the edge of town, given the constraints of our community, of you know, similar arguments that happened during the Camino Pablo discussion of whether or not we're adding more units in places where you have limited access to getting in and out, where in the center of or in the two centers, they're on the main travel routes in and out of town. That is the safe place to really have density, rather than having individual affordable units out in the Bluffs, for example. Not to pick on the Bluffs, it's one of the more far-flung parts of Moraga. I can imagine the better part of that being in the centers, but I definitely could change my feeling on that, which is why I think the compromise proposition that I heard from both Councilmember Mocker and I believe also from the mayor of just being able to see an analysis for either way, so that we're not, we know exactly what it is that we're accepting, I think would be very helpful.
Thank you. All right, Afsha, are you good now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right. Mike, anything anything additive?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's on a different topic. So Afsha, I thought you did a great recap on what everybody said and a great job of listening. I thought I did hear requests on parking and inclusionary for more information. So is that something that staff could do? If I heard right?
Well, I think what I heard was on TDM strategies specifically.
So I guess what I could say is we will be really synthesizing all the information and direction that you provided us. And we will be coming back to the council in the coming weeks to receive policy direction from the council on these items. Does that help?
Mike, I think the places where people wanted more information were noted, and they were in the two places that you mentioned.
Okay, just want to make sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Any other? This was extremely helpful. Thank you, each and every one of you, for your thoughtfulness and your perspectives and for your commitment to this. So do I need a motion to adjourn, or can I just adjourn this meeting?
There should technically be a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Sorry.
Okay, we have don't all talk at once. We have a motion from Vice Mayor Wolicky and a second from Councilmember McClure. I will do the roll call vote. Let's go. Commissioners Bodie?
Yes.
Davis?
Aye.
Polsky?
Aye.
Thiel?
Aye.
Vice Chair Lester?
Aye.
Chair Hillis?
Aye.
Council members Macker?
Aye.
Onoda?
Yes.
McClure?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Wolicky?
Yes.
Mayor Sauce is a yes. Motion to adjourn passes unanimously. Thank you, everyone. Great job. Good discussion. Have a wonderful evening.